Greetings, travellers of the spirit. Welcome to the sanctuary of Get Cozy Sleep. You have left the noise of the modern world behind. The emails, the notifications, the demands of the day, they cannot follow you here. Here, in this quiet corner, we walk the ancient paths to find the rest that your soul has been longing for. If your heart seeks the steadfast strength of the ancient Galilean hills, if you find comfort in the gentle rhythm of a shepherd's crook tapping against the earth, and if you have ever felt small, unnoticed, yet yearn to be held, then this story is your refuge tonight. So, let the weight of the day fall from your shoulders, settle deeper into the embrace of your pillows, unclench your jaw, soften your hands, close your eyes, and let the walls of your room dissolve into the mist. Let us travel back across the sands of time to Greenhollow, a secluded valley tucked away in the rolling highlands of Galilee. The air here is crisp, smelling of wet earth and new grass. Breathe in grace, exhale the worry. The time for work is done, the time for rest is here. The muddy lamb of Greenhollow. The wind did not merely blow across the valley of Greenhollow, it scoured it. It came rushing down from the snow-capped peaks of Mount Hermon in the far north, tumbling over the limestone ridges, whistling through the gnarled branches of the ancient olive trees, until it settled, heavy and cold, into the basin where Caleb's farm lay. It was early spring, that fragile, shivering time when the world hangs suspended between the death of winter and the promise of life. The grass was already pushing through the soil, a vibrant, defiant green, but the air still carried the biting frost of the nights past. In the centre of the valley, the stone buildings of the farm stood like grey sentinels against the sweeping landscape. The main house was sturdy, built from rough-hewn basalt that had absorbed the heat of 1,000 summers and repelled the storms of 1,000 winters. Around it, the sheepfolds were clustered, their low walls topped with bundles of thorny acacia branches to keep the prowling jackals at bay. Elara pushed the broom across the cobblestones of the lower courtyard. The broom was made of stiff twigs bound together with twine, and the handle was thick, polished smooth by hands much larger and stronger than hers. At 8 years old, Elara was a slip of a thing, pale and quiet, like a winter reed that might snap in a gale. She wore a woolen tunic that had once belonged to one of the master's daughters, hemmed up clumsily to fit her small frame, and an oversized coat made of rough grey felt that swallowed her whole. Swish, scrape, swish, scrape. The rhythm of her work was the only sound she made. She swept away the dust, the stray wisps of hay, and the dried mud left by the boots of the shepherds. She was efficient, not because she loved the work, but because she had learned that invisibility was a kind of safety. If the courtyard was clean, Master Caleb had no reason to look at her. If she made no noise, she would not be scolded. She stopped for a moment, leaning her chin on the top of the broom handle, and looked out towards the eastern hills. The sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the sky in bruises of violet and burnt orange. The hills of Galilee were breathtaking in this light, soft, undulating curves that looked like the back of a sleeping giant. Somewhere out there, the red anemones and delicate cyclamens were blooming in the crevices of the rocks, vivid splashes of colour that no one but the birds saw. Elara sighed, a tiny puff of white mist escaping her lips. "Stop dreaming, girl." The voice cracked through the air like a whip. Elara flinched, her shoulders hunching instinctively. She turned to see Silas, the head shepherd, striding across the yard. He was a mountain of a man, with a beard that looked like a tangle of steel wool, and eyes that were always scanning the horizon for danger. "The ewes are restless," Silas grunted, not stopping to look at her, but throwing the words in her direction as he passed. "Bring more straw to the birthing barn, the night will be long, and the wind is shifting." Yes, Master Silas," Elara whispered, though he was already out of earshot. She abandoned the broom and hurried towards the hayloft. The farm was buzzing with a nervous energy. It was the beginning of the lambing season, the most critical time of the year. For the next few weeks, Sleep would be a luxury. The fate of the farm, the wealth of Master Caleb, depended on how many lambs survived the cold nights. Ilara climbed the wooden ladder to the loft, the splintery rungs biting into her cold palms. Inside, the air was thick with the sweet, dry scent of stored summer grass. It was warmer here, and for a second, she allowed herself to sink into a pile of loose hay. Closing her eyes, it smelled of sunshine and memories she didn't have. She didn't remember her parents. She had been acquired when, as Master Caleb put it, from a distant relative in a village near Nazareth when she was just a toddler. She wasn't a slave, exactly, but she wasn't family either. She was the girl, the one who fetched the water, scrubbed the pots, and swept the yards. She existed in the margins of the farm's life, like a shadow that lengthens at sunset. Gathering an armful of golden straw, she made her way down. The bundle was almost as big as she was, scratching her cheek and getting into her hair. She trudged across the yard to the long, low building that served as the maternity ward for the flock. As she pushed open the heavy wooden door, a wave of heat and sound washed over her. The barn was dimly lit by oil lamps hanging from the cedar beams, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. The air was heavy, pungent with the smell of animals, lanolin, damp wool, and the metallic tang of birth. Hundreds of ewes were packed into the pens. Some were lying down, chewing their cud with a rhythmic, side-to-side motion of their jaws. Others were pacing nervously, bleating low in their throats. The shepherds moved among them like priests in a chaotic temple, checking udders, feeling bellies, their voices low and soothing. Ilara moved to the empty pens in the corner, scattering the fresh straw on the earthen floor. She tried to make it soft. She imagined what it would be like to be born onto this cold, hard earth, and she wanted the first thing these new lives felt to be something gentle. "Careful there," a voice murmured nearby. Ilara looked up. It was Hannah, the cook's daughter, who was a few years older and infinitely more confident. Hannah was holding a lantern while her father examined a ewe. Hannah had a home. She had a mother who braided her hair by the fire, and a father who scolded her with affection. Ilara looked down at her own hands, red, chapped, the fingernails broken and rimmed with dirt. She spread the straw thicker. "Is it tonight?" Ilara asked, her voice barely audible over the bleating. Hannah glanced at her, surprised she had spoken. "Father says the moon is full. They always come when the moon is full. It pulls them out, he says." Ilara nodded. She didn't know about the moon pulling things, but she felt a strange tension in her own chest. It was a waiting, a heavy, expectant silence beneath the noise. She finished her task and retreated to the shadows near the door. She wasn't allowed to leave yet. There might be more fetching and carrying to do. She pulled her grey coat tighter around herself and sat on an overturned milking stool. Outside, the wind howled again, rattling the wooden shutters. It was a lonely sound. It sounded like a wolf searching for a way in. Ilara wrapped her arms around her knees. In this crowded barn, surrounded by hundreds of living, breathing creatures, she felt entirely alone. The sheep had the shepherds had each other. The farm had Master Caleb. Ilara had the broom, and the straw, and the cold wind that found every hole in her coat. She watched a ewe in the nearest pen lie down heavily, groaning. The cycle of life was beginning again. Birth and blood and struggle. Ilara watched, her large, dark eyes reflecting the flickering lamplight, waiting for the night to truly begin. She did not know it yet, but the wind that scoured the valley was bringing something specifically for her. Something broken, something small. Something that would change the shape of her heart forever. The silence of the waiting did not last long. It broke, not with a shout, but with a low, guttural groan that seemed to rise from the very earth beneath the barn floor. Suddenly, the stillness shattered. The barn, previously a place of quiet anticipation, transformed into a theatre of urgent life. The air grew thick, humid, and heavy with the primal sense of iron and wet wool. It was a chaotic symphony, the deep, rhythmic bleating of the mothers, the high-pitched, bewildered cries of the newborns, and the sharp, commanding voices of the shepherds calling for water, for rags, for light. Elara was no longer a statue in the corner. She became a blur of motion. "Girl, hot water now!" Silas bellowed from the far end of the row. Elara scrambled, grabbing the heavy bucket from the iron stove in the corner. The water sloshed, scalding her wrist, but she bit her lip and ran. The straw beneath her feet was slippery now, treacherous with the fluids of birth. She wove through the pens, dodging the legs of men and beasts, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She poured the water into a basin where Silas was kneeling. His hands, usually so rough and calloused, were covered in slick fluids as he worked to turn a lamb that was breached. Elara watched for a split second, her eyes wide. With a wet squelch and a grunt of effort, Silas pulled, and a bundle of wet, grey wool slid into the world. The shepherd quickly cleared the creature's nose. The lamb shook its head, a tiny, violent motion, and let out a sneeze. Then, a cry, thin, wavering, but undeniably alive. "A ram," Silas grunted, satisfaction in his voice. "Strong legs, good." He tossed the lamb toward the mother, who immediately began to lick it vigorously, her rough tongue scraping away the birthing sac, claiming it, warming it. Elara felt a strange tightness in her throat. It was a miracle, repeated over and over down the length of the barn, yet it never ceased to be terrifying and beautiful. She wanted to stay and watch the mother and child, but another voice called out, "Rags! Clean rags!" She ran again. Hours bled into one another. The moon outside climbed high into the black sky, indifferent to the struggle below. The barn became a sauna of body heat. Elara's arms ached. Her tunic was stained with splashes of water and mud. Sweat plastered her hair to her forehead. Then, the heavy oak door creaked open, admitting a blast of freezing night air that cut through the humidity like a knife. The lanterns flickered wildly. Master Caleb stepped inside. He was a man carved from the same basalt as his house, solid, unyielding, and etched with the lines of worry. He held a ledger in one hand and a piece of charcoal in the other. He did not look at the miracle of life. He looked at the inventory. "Report," he said, his voice gravelly. 12 so far, Master," Silas replied, wiping his forehead with his sleeve. 8 rams, 4 ewes, all standing, 2 sets of twins expected before dawn." Caleb nodded, making a sharp mark in his book. "And the spotted ewe in pen 5? "Lost the lamb, stillborn." Caleb's face didn't change, but his shoulders sagged slightly. "Pity. She's good stock." He moved down the aisle, his eyes scanning the pens, assessing, calculating. He was not a cruel man, Elara knew. He was a man carrying the weight of the farm, the wages of the shepherds, and the taxes of the Roman census on his back. In his world, there was no room for sentimentality. A lamb was either an asset or a liability. Elara shrank back into the shadows as he passed. She was holding a bundle of fresh straw, trying to make herself as small as a grain of wheat. "What's happening here?" Caleb stopped at the last pen on the left. It was a small, cramped enclosure in the draftiest corner of the barn. Inside, a young ewe, a first-time mother, was pacing frantically. She was distressed, bleating high and sharp. "She's been labouring hard, Master," a younger shepherd said nervously. "Something's wrong." "She's too narrow." Caleb frowned, stepping closer. "Let me see." He entered the pen, his movements efficient. Elara crept closer, peering through the wooden slats. She saw the ewe collapse onto her side, exhausted. With one final, shuddering heave, she expelled her burden. The lamb did not slide out easily. It tumbled. It landed not on the fresh pile of straw Elara had laid down earlier, but rolled into a depression in the earth floor where the roof had leaked. A puddle of cold mud, mixed with the runoff of the stable, welcomed the new life. The lamb lay there, a wet, dark lump in the mire. It was tiny, shockingly small compared to the others. Its legs were spindly, looking as fragile as dry twigs. It didn't shake its head. It didn't sneeze. It just lay there, shivering violently as the cold mud seeped into its wet fleece. "Get it up," Caleb ordered. The young shepherd reached in and lifted the creature. It hung limp in his hands, covered in black slime. He set it on its feet, but its legs buckled instantly. It collapsed back into the dirt with a soft, pathetic sound. The mother ewe turned. She sniffed the air. She smelled the blood, but she also smelled the sour stench of the mud and the sickness of weakness. She looked at the trembling thing on the ground. Then she turned away. She walked to the other side of the pen and began to eat hay, her back turned resolutely to her offspring. "She rejects it," Caleb said flatly. The verdict was immediate. "She's young, master. Maybe if we clean it," the shepherd suggested weakly. Caleb shook his head. "Look at its hind leg. Twisted. It's a runt and it's crippled. She knows it won't survive the march to the summer pastures. Nature is wise, even when it is cruel." He marked something in his ledger, a scratch, a deletion. "Don't waste milk on it," Caleb said, turning to leave the pen. "Focus on the healthy ones. If it's still alive in the morning, we'll deal with it then. But don't let it suckle the others. It might carry sickness." He stepped out, his boots crunching on the straw. "Keep the lanterns high. I don't want any accidents." The men moved away. The focus shifted to a sturdy ewe birthing twins in the next stall. The excitement moved on. Elara stood frozen. She looked into the pen. The mother ewe was chewing calmly. In the puddle of mud, the tiny, discarded thing was trying to lift its head. It let out a sound, not a bleat but a whimper. A sound so full of confusion and cold that it pierced straight through Elara's chest. It was covered in filth. It was unwanted. It was broken. It was her. Slowly, carefully, making sure Master Caleb's back was turned, Elara took a step toward the pen. Her heart was pounding not with fear of the master, but with a sudden, fierce recognition. The cold wind rattled the loose boards near the pen, blowing a draught of icy air directly onto the wet lamb. It shuddered, its eyes squeezed shut against a world that had offered it nothing but a cold shoulder and a mud puddle. Elara's hand gripped the wooden rail. She knew the rules. She knew she was just the girl with the broom. But as she watched the muddy creature struggle to take a single breath, something in her snapped. Or perhaps something in her finally woke up. The barn door swung shut behind Master Caleb, sealing the warmth back inside. But for the creature in the corner pen, the cold had already done its work. The other shepherds drifted away, drawn by the urgent cries of healthy lambs and the demands of successful births. To them, the tragedy in Pen 5 was already a finished chapter. It was a loss, yes, but a small one in the grand arithmetic of the night. Nature was a ruthless accountant, and they had learned long ago not to argue with her ledger. Elara did not move. She stood gripping the rough cedar rail, her knuckles white against the dark wood. The noise of the barn, the bleating, the low murmurs of men, the rustle of straw, faded into a dull roar in her ears. Her entire world narrowed down to the square of damp earth in front of her. The mother ewe, a sturdy creature with a coat the colour of oatmeal, had finished eating her hay. She lay down now, content, her back firmly turned toward the dark bundle in the mud. Occasionally the lamb would twitch, a spasmodic jerk of a leg that splashed softly in the muck. Each time it moved, the mother's ear would swivel back, a flicker of instinct, but she did not turn her head. She knew the smell of death, even when it was still breathing. Elara watched, her breath hitching in her chest. She knew that feeling, the feeling of being close to warmth but unable to touch it. She remembered the day she arrived at the farm 5 years ago. She had been 3, clutching a rag doll that had lost one eye. She remembered the towering legs of the adults, the way they spoke over her head as if she were a piece of furniture being bartered. "She's small," Master Caleb had said then, looking at her with the same practical appraisal he used for livestock. But she'll eat less. She'd not been hugged that day, or the day after. Slowly, as if moving through water, Elara unlatched the gate. It swung open with a groan of rusty iron that seemed deafening in the quiet corner, but no one looked up. Silas was busy with a breech berth 3 pens down. The younger boys were laughing near the brazier, heating wine. Elara stepped into the pen. The mud sucked at her worn sandals. It was cold and smelled of ammonia and rot. She knelt, disregarding the filth that immediately soaked into the hem of her tunic. "Hey," she whispered. The word was a tiny puff of air, vanishing instantly. The lamb lay on its side. It was a mess of tangled, wet wool and black earth. Its eyes were squeezed shut, crusted with mucus. It was shivering so violently that its teeth, tiny, newly formed things, were clicking together. Elara reached out. Her hand hovered for a moment, trembling. She was forbidden to touch the stock unnecessarily. "Do not spoil them," Silas always said. "Sheep are not pets." But this was not stock. This was garbage. And Elara was the one who swept the garbage. She laid her hand on the lamb's flank. It was shockingly cold. The icy chill of the mud had seeped through the thin skin, reaching for the bone. But beneath the cold, beneath the matted, filthy wool, she felt it. A flutter. Thump, 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 thump. A heart beating with a frantic, desperate rhythm against the silence of the universe. The lamb gasped, a wet, rattling sound, and tried to lift its head. It failed, its muzzle falling back into the slurry. "You're not trash to..." Elara hissed fiercely, tears suddenly stinging her eyes. She wiped them away with a dirty wrist, leaving a streak of soot across her cheek. "You're not..." She looked at the mother ewe. "He's cold," she whispered accusingly. "Look at him." The ewe chewed her cud, staring blankly at the wooden wall. Elara looked around. On a hook nearby hung an old grain sack, made of rough burlap, used for carrying feed. It was dusty and smelled of oats, but it was dry. She snatched it down. With gentle, clumsy hands, she began to wipe the worst of the slime from the lamb's face. The rough burlap scratched against the wet wool, but the friction created a tiny spark of heat. The lamb stopped its rattling gasp for a second and let out a soft sigh. "I can't leave you here," she murmured, her voice trembling. "If I leave you, the rats will come, or the cold will stop your heart before the sun comes up." She looked towards the barn door. It was heavy, barred for the night. Master Caleb would be in the main house now, eating his supper by the fire. Silas and the men would take shifts sleeping in the loft above the barn. Elara made a decision. It wasn't a calculated plan, it was an impulse born of a starving heart. She didn't think about the punishment if she were caught, the cane, or worse, being sent away to the orphanage in the city. She only thought of the fading heartbeat under her hand. She stood up, her knees wet and shaking. She looked down at the muddy bundle. "Wait for me," she whispered. "Just hold on. When the lantern oil runs low, I'm coming back." She backed out of the pen, latching the gate with agonizing slowness to avoid a sound. She picked up her broom again, standing in the shadows, her eyes fixed on the heap of misery in the corner. She resumed her sweeping, the rhythmic swish-scrape returning. But her heart was no longer in the rhythm of the work. Her heart was in the mud. Outside, the wind shifted. It stopped howling and began to moan, a low, mournful sound that rattled the eaves. The darkness of the night deepened, settling over Greenhollow like a heavy blanket. But in the corner of the barn, under the indifferent gaze of the mother, a promise had been made. And for the first time in its short, miserable life, the muddy lamb was not entirely alone. The barn had settled into a heavy, rhythmic slumber. The oil in the lanterns had burned low, leaving only a few dim halos of orange light struggling against the encroaching shadows. The air was thick with the droning chorus of the shepherd's snores, deep, rumbling sounds that vibrated through the wooden loft above. Even the sheep had quieted, their earlier bleating replaced by the soft, collective breathing of the flock. Elara sat huddled in the corner, her knees drawn up to her chest. She had not slept. She had been counting the snores, waiting for the rhythm to become steady, unbreakable. Now, she stood up. Her legs were stiff from the cold, pins and needles pricking at her feet. She glanced up at the loft. Silas was asleep. She could hear the distinct, raspy whistle of his breath, like a saw cutting through green wood. She moved, not walking but gliding, a skill she had perfected over years of trying to be invisible. She kept her weight on the balls of her feet, avoiding the patches of loose straw that would rustle too loudly. She reached the pen in the corner. The mother ewe was asleep, her head tucked into her flank. In the mud puddle, the dark bundle had stopped moving. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced Elara's chest. Was she too late? She unlatched the gate. She didn't open it fully, just enough to squeeze her small body through. She knelt in the mire. The smell was overpowering now, a mixture of sickness and waste. She reached out and touched the lamb's neck. It was still warm, faintly. "I'm here," she mouthed, no sound coming out. She took the burlap sack she'd hidden earlier. Carefully, agonizingly slowly, she wrapped it around the lamb's body. The creature was limp, a dead weight in her hands. It let out a tiny, stifled grunt as she lifted it. Elara froze. Up in the loft, a snore broke. Someone shifted. The straw rustled loudly. "What?" a voice mumbled. "Jonah, the youngest shepherd." Elara dropped to the ground, curling her body over the lamb, shielding it with her own grey coat. She pressed her face into the filth of the floor, holding her breath until her lungs burned. Silence returned. Then, the rhythm of breathing resumed. She didn't dare stand up again. Instead, she crawled. She dragged herself and her burden backward out of the pen, her knees sinking into the damp earth. Once she was in the aisle, she gathered the lamb into her arms, hugging it tight against her chest. The mud from its fleece soaked instantly through her tunic, cold and wet against her skin. But she didn't care. She made for the side door, the small one used for mucking out, not the heavy main doors that groaned like dying giants. She reached the latch. It was iron, cold enough to burn her fingers. She lifted it. Click. She pushed. The door swung outward, and the night rushed in to meet her. The wind hit her like a physical blow. It was a living thing, wild and furious, tearing at her hair and stinging her eyes. It carried the scent of frost and wet limestone. Elara stepped out and pulled the door shut behind her. She was outside. The world was vast and terrifyingly open. The sky was a cavern of black velvet, pierced by the hard, diamond glitter of winter stars. The moon hung low over the western ridge, casting long, skeletal shadows across the farmyard. She heard a low growl. From the shadow of the water trough, a pair of eyes reflected the moonlight. It was Bear, the massive sheepdog with a coat like tangled wire. He stood up, his hackles raised, a low rumble vibrating in his throat. He was trained to stop thieves. Elara froze. If he barked, it was over. "Bear," she whispered, the wind snatching the name from her lips. "It's me, Elara." The dog took a stiff-legged step forward, sniffing the air. He smelled the fear on her. He smelled the sheep scent. But he also smelled the scrap of dried meat she'd secretly fed him 2 days ago. His ears lowered. The growl died in his throat. He stepped forward and nudged her hand with a wet, cold nose. He didn't wag his tail, he was on duty, but he stepped aside, allowing her to pass. A silent conspiracy. "Good boy," she breathed. She didn't look back. She turned toward the hills. The path she chose was not the main drover's road, but a goat track that wound up the rocky slope behind the farm. It was steep and treacherous, littered with loose shale that clattered under her sandals. The climb was brutal. The lamb, though small, felt heavier with every step. Its dead weight pulled at her arms, making her shoulders ache. The wind pushed against her chest, trying to force her back down into the valley, back to her place in the ashes. One step, Another step. Her breath came in ragged gasps that formed white clouds in the darkness. Her legs burned. She slipped once, her knee striking a sharp rock, tearing skin. She bit back a cry, clutching the lamb tighter. The creature was shivering against her, a vibration that travelled into her own bones. Almost there, she panted. Almost. She was heading for a place she called the Cleft. It wasn't a proper cave, just a hollow in the limestone ridge, shielded by a dense thicket of thorny acacia bushes. She had found it last summer while looking for lost kindling. It was small, dry, and invisible from the path below. She reached the thicket. The thorns snagged her coat, pulling at the wool like greedy fingers, but she pushed through, shielding the lamb with her body. Behind the bushes, the rock opened up like a dark mouth. She ducked inside. The wind instantly vanished. The air here was still and smelled of dried dust and old stone. It was a womb of rock. Elara collapsed onto the sandy floor, her legs giving way. She sat there in the darkness, gasping for air, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She was shaking, from cold, from exertion, from terror. She looked down at the bundle in her lap. In the absolute silence of the cave, she heard it. A soft, wheezing breath. Then another. They had made it. She was a thief now, a runaway. But as she sat there in the dark, with the wind howling impotently outside, she didn't feel like a sinner. She felt, for the first time in her life, like a guardian. The darkness inside the cave was not empty. It was heavy, like a woolen blanket drawn over the head of the world. Elara sat on the sandy floor, her legs folded beneath her, listening to the wind prowl outside the entrance. It scratched at the rock face and hissed through the thorns of the acacia bush, searching for them. But here, deep in the cleft of the limestone, the air was still. It was cold, a dry, ancient cold that radiated from the heart of the mountain, but it was still. She could not see the lamb. She could only feel it. It lay across her lap, a sodden weight. The heat she had felt earlier seemed to be evaporating, leaking out into the stone. The shivering had stopped, which terrified her more than the shaking had. Stillness, in the language of the farm, often meant the end. "No," she whispered, the word bouncing softly off the low ceiling. "You don't get to sleep yet." She needed warmth. Real warmth. She fumbled with the fastenings of her coat, the oversized grey felt garment that had been her shield against the world. Her fingers were stiff, clumsy with cold, but she managed to undo the wooden toggles. She slipped her arms out of the sleeves. Immediately, the chill of the cave bit through her thin linen tunic, raising gooseflesh on her arms. She gritted her teeth against the shiver that rattled her own spine. She was small, and she had no fat to keep her warm, but she had a fire inside her chest that felt like it could burn down a forest. She took the heavy coat and draped it over the lamb, tucking the edges under its belly, creating a cocoon. Then, she did something forbidden. She lay down on the dust, curving her body around the bundle, pulling it tight against her chest. She became the ewe. She became the shelter. "Warm up," she commanded softly. "Please." She lay there for what felt like an hour, her eyes wide open in the dark. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the heat from her own body began to seep into the layers of wool and felt. The dampness of the mud grew warm. Then, she felt it. A movement. A tiny nose nudged against her ribs. It was a weak, searching motion. Instinct. The will to live, asserting itself against the odds. The lamb was hungry. Elara sat up, keeping the coat wrapped tight around the creature. She reached into the sash of her tunic. There, tied securely with a leather thong, was a small clay flask. It was rough pottery, chipped at the rim, the kind used by the poorest labourers to carry oil or water. Inside was her supper, or rather, the supper she had not eaten. A portion of goat's milk, skimmed from the top of the pail when the cook wasn't looking. She'd saved it, not knowing why. Perhaps just to have something that was hers alone. Now she knew why. She uncorked the flask. The smell of the milk was rich and sweet in the stale air of the cave. "Here," she whispered. She couldn't pour it. The lamb would choke, or worse. She would spill the precious liquid in the dark. She dipped her forefinger into the flask. The milk felt cool and silky. She brought her wet finger to the lamb's muzzle. She brushed it against the cold, wet nose, then pried the tiny jaws open gently. Nothing happened. The lamb lay limp. "Come on," Elara urged, her voice trembling. "It's good." "It's sweet." She dipped her finger again, coating it thickly, and pressed it into the lamb's mouth, rubbing the milk against the roof of its mouth. For a long, heart-stopping moment, there was no reaction. The little head lolled against her wrist. Then, a twitch. The rough, sandpaper texture of a tongue moved against her skin. A reflex, then another. And then, a weak, tentative suction. The sensation was electric. It shot from her fingertips straight to her heart. The lamb was sucking. Elara let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding, a sound that was half laugh, half sob. She dipped her finger again, and again, and again. Dip, suckle, swallow, dip, suckle, swallow. It was a slow, tedious rhythm. Her arm began to ache. The cold of the cave floor seeped into her hips, but she didn't stop. In the absolute darkness, this tiny, rhythmic connection was the only thing that existed. She was feeding life into something that had been marked for death. With every drop of milk that transferred from the clay flask to the lamb's belly, Elara felt a strange hollowness in her own stomach vanish. She wasn't eating, yet she felt full. She was freezing, yet she felt a warmth spreading through her veins that no fire could match. The lamb's shivering returned, but this time it was different. It wasn't the violent shudder of hypothermia, it was the vibration of energy returning. The creature shifted, pushing its legs against Elara's thigh, trying to find a better position. It let out a soft sound, a satisfied, milky burp. Elara giggled. The sound was startling in the silence. She hadn't giggled in... She couldn't remember when. She corked the flask. It was half empty. She would save the rest for morning. She lay back down, pulling the heavy coat over both of them. The lamb, sensing the heat source, wriggled closer until its head was resting on her shoulder, its muddy fleece pressed against her neck. The smell was earthy and pungent, but to Elara, it smelled like belonging. Outside, the wind finally began to die down, exhausted by its own fury. The silence of the high hills returned, vast and deep. Elara closed her eyes. Her hand rested on the lamb's flank, feeling the steady rise and fall of its breathing. Thump, 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 thump. It was stronger now. She was a thief. She was a runaway. She was alone in a hole in the ground. But as sleep finally pulled her under, Elara thought that perhaps, for the first time in 8 years, she was exactly where she was meant to be. The morning did not break into the cave, it seeped in. It began as a dilution of the darkness, turning the black air to a soft, charcoal grey. Then, a single beam of pale, watery sunlight pierced through the tangled screen of acacia thorns, painting a jagged stripe across the sandy floor. Elara woke with a start. Her body was stiff. Her neck cricked at an awkward angle against the stone wall. For a terrifying second, she didn't know where she was. The smell of dust and damp wool filled her nose, foreign and strange compared to the usual scent of the hayloft where she slept. Then, the weight on her legs shifted. She looked down. The grey felt coat was moving. A small, knobby head poked out from the folds, blinking against the new light. He was alive. A rush of relief, so potent it felt like dizziness, washed over her. Elara sat up, wincing as the blood rushed back into her numb limbs. She pulled the coat away. In the unforgiving light of day, The lamb looked disastrous. Last night, the darkness had hidden the worst of it, but now, revealed by the morning sun, he was a sorry sight. The mud from the barn floor had dried into a hard, cracked crust that encased his body like a suit of ill-fitting armour. His fleece wasn't white, or even cream. It was the colour of a ploughed field. His tail was matted into a heavy club of dirt. His ears were droopy, one slightly lower than the other. He looked less like the lamb and more like a clod of earth that had miraculously sprouted legs. He looked at her, his eyes dark and liquid, framed by crusty lashes. He let out a sound, not the weak whimper of the night before, but a distinct, rasping mare. Elara laughed. It was a rusty sound, scraping her throat, but it felt good. "You look terrible," she whispered, reaching out to touch him. Her fingers met resistance. The mud was baked on tight. She tried to pry a clump of dried earth from his shoulder, but the lamb flinched and pulled away. It pulled at his skin. "Sorry," she murmured, pulling her hand back. It stuck fast. The lamb struggled to his feet. He was wobbly, his legs splaying out like a newborn foal's. But he stood. He took a staggering step toward her, sniffing at her tunic, searching for the milk. "Greedy thing," she chided gently. She retrieved the clay flask. There wasn't much left, just a few swallows. She repeated the process of the night before, dipping her finger, letting him suckle. He was stronger today. His suction was fierce, desperate. When the flask was empty, he headbutted her hand, demanding more. "That's all," she said, showing him the empty vessel. "I have to get more. I have to go back." The reality of the morning crashed down on her, the farm, Silas, the broom. If she wasn't in the courtyard by the time the sun cleared the eastern ridge, questions would be asked. She stood up, brushing the cave dust from her tunic. The lamb bleated, a high, anxious sound, and tried to follow her. "No, no," Elara said quickly, crouching back down. She placed her hands on his tiny shoulders, or where his shoulders would be under the mud-caked wool. "You have to stay. You can't come down there. They don't want you." The lamb stared at her, uncomprehending. "I need to call you something," she mused, tilting her head. "I can't just call you sheep. Master Caleb calls them all stock." "But you're not stock." She looked at his messy, earth-coloured coat. She thought of names like Midnight or Storm, but they felt too grand for this little scrap of life. She thought of Mud, but that was cruel. Then she remembered a story the old cook used to tell, fragments of scripture she muttered while kneading dough. A story about a man named Barnabas, who was called the Son of Encouragement. Elara looked at the lamb. He wasn't encouraging anyone. He was a mess. But holding him last night, feeling his heart beat against hers, had taken away the cold ache of loneliness that usually filled her chest. He was a comfort. "Barney," she decided. It sounded soft, round, friendly. "Your name is Barney." The lamb blinked. "Barney," she repeated firmly. "You stay here. Barney, stay in the rock." She gathered dry leaves and bracken from the back of the cave, piling them into a makeshift nest in the deepest corner, away from the wind. She guided him onto it. "I'll come back," she promised, her voice fierce. "I promise. When the sun goes down behind the ridge, I'll bring milk." She grabbed her heavy coat, shaking it out. It was stained with mud on the inside, but the outside was still grey and nondescript. She put it on, buttoning it to her chin to hide her dirty tunic. She squeezed through the acacia thorns, the sharp branches scratching her cheek. She didn't flinch. She was already thinking of her descent. She paused outside the cave, looking down at the valley below. Greenhollow lay spread out like a map. She could see the thin ribbons of smoke rising from the farmhouse chimneys. She could see the tiny specks of the shepherds moving the flocks toward the lower pastures. Down there, she was Elara the orphan, Elara the invisible, Elara with the broom. But up here, in the secret cleft of the rock, she was something else entirely. She was a mother. She was a protector. She was the keeper of a life. She took a deep breath of the sharp morning air, filling her lungs with courage. Then she began the steep climb down, leaving her heart behind in the stone, wrapped in a layer of dried mud. The descent from the limestone ridge was a journey between two worlds. Above, in the cool shadow of the cleft, time seemed to stand still, measured only by the rhythmic breathing of a muddy lamb. Below, in the basin of Greenhollow, time was a relentless taskmaster, driven by the sun and the demands of the flock. Elara slipped back into the farmyard just as the first rooster, a ragged, arrogant bird with plumage like an oil slick, sounded his cry from the fence post. The mist was still clinging to the ground, swirling around her ankles like ghostly water. She moved quickly, her heart beating a frantic tattoo against her ribs. She was not the same girl who had swept this courtyard yesterday. Yesterday, she had been empty. Today, she carried a secret that felt heavy and hot in her chest, like a swallowed coal. She reached the wash trough near the kitchen door. The water in it was freezing, coated with a thin film of ice. She broke it with her fist, plunging her hands in to scrub away the cave dust and the telltale smell of the wild. She splashed the icy water onto her face, gasping as the cold shocked her awake. She needed to look sharp. She needed to look presentable. "You're up early?" Elara froze, water dripping from her chin. Martha, the cook, stood in the doorway. She was a woman shaped like a rising loaf of bread, warm and soft in appearance, but with eyes that missed nothing. She held a basket of eggs in one hand. I couldn't sleep," Elara stammered, grabbing the rough linen towel hanging on the wall. "I thought I'd start on the copper pots." Martha eyed her critically. She looked at Elara's red hands, her wind-blown hair, and the dark circles under her eyes. "You look like a drowned rat," Martha said, not unkindly, but with her usual bluntness. "And you're shivering. Come inside before you catch a fever and I have to nurse you." "I have enough to do with the shearers coming next week." Elara followed her into the kitchen. It was the heart of the farmhouse, a low-ceilinged room dominated by a massive stone hearth where a fire was already crackling. The air smelled of wood smoke, rising dough, and drying herbs. "Sit," Martha commanded, pointing to a small stool near the fire. She ladled a bowl of porridge from the cauldron bubbling over the flames, a grey, lumpy mixture of barley and water. Then she did something unexpected. She took a pitcher of fresh goat's milk and poured a generous splash over the porridge. "Eat," she said. "You're too thin. Master Caleb hates thin servants. Makes him look stingy." Elara stared at the bowl. The steam rose up, carrying the sweet, creamy scent of the milk. Her stomach gave a violent growl, a cramping emptiness that reminded her she hadn't eaten since yesterday noon. She picked up her wooden spoon. Her hand trembled. She wanted to devour it. Every instinct in her body screamed to shovel the warm food into her mouth. But then an image flashed in her mind. Dark eyes, mud-crusted wool, a tiny, seeking mouth. Barney was up there, alone, hungry. Elara looked around. Martha had turned her back to knead dough on the long wooden table. The kitchen was empty otherwise. Moving with the sleight of hand of a street magician, Elara reached into her tunic and pulled out the clay flask. She uncorked it with her teeth. She tipped the bowl. The milk, pooling on top of the thick porridge, slid into the flask. She guided it carefully, catching the creamy liquid while holding back the barley. It was a messy, desperate operation. A few drops spilled onto her thumb, which she quickly licked off. She managed to save perhaps half a cup. It wasn't enough, but it was something. She corked the flask and hid it back in her sash. Then she forced herself to eat the dry, sticky barley. It tasted like sawdust in her mouth, but she swallowed it down. She needed strength. If she fainted, she couldn't climb the hill. "Done already?" Martha asked, turning around. "Yes, thank you," Elara said, standing up. "It was delicious." "Go on then." Martha waved a flour-dusted hand. "The master wants the courtyard swept before the sun hits the dial." and check the water troughs. If they're frozen, break the ice. The day that followed was an exercise in agony. Elara threw herself into her work with a manic intensity. She swept the cobblestones until not a single piece of straw remained. She hauled buckets of water from the well, the rope biting into her palms, her shoulders burning with the weight. She scrubbed the stone steps leading to the upper rooms until her knees were raw. She worked hard because she was terrified that if she stopped, even for a moment, someone would see the truth on her face. She felt like she was made of glass. Surely, anyone looking at her could see the image of the lamb burning inside her. Every time Silas walked past, barking orders at the dogs, Elara flinched. Every time Master Caleb stood on the porch, reviewing his ledger, she held her breath. Do they know? Can they smell the sheep on me? Did they count the flock and find one missing? But the farm was a machine of chaos during lambing season. No one counted the dead piles. No one noticed the girl with the broom, except to tell her she missed a spot. Yet, amidst the fear and the exhaustion, there was a strange new undercurrent running through her veins. Usually the drudgery of the farm crushed her spirit. The sweeping was pointless, the dust always returned, the scrubbing was endless. But today, the work felt different. It was no longer her life, it was merely the price she paid for her life. Every sweep of the broom was a second closer to sunset. Every bucket of water was a trade, her labour for his safety. She found herself smiling at odd moments. When she was cleaning the chicken coop, chasing away a broody hen, she laughed. The other servants looked at her strangely. Elara the sombre never laughed. Sun's got to her head, Jonah muttered, passing by with a bale of hay. Elara didn't care. She had a secret. She touched the spot on her waist where the flask pressed against her skin. It was warm. It was a physical anchor to the reality waiting for her up on the ridge. The afternoon stretched out, long and golden. The sun seemed to drag its feet across the sky, lingering stubbornly over the western hills. Elara watched the shadows lengthen, measuring them against the stones of the courtyard. Just a little longer, she told herself, gripping the handle of the broom. Just hold on, Barney. I'm coming. She was living two lives now. In one, she was a servant, bound to the earth, commanded by men. In the other, she was a guardian, bound only to love, commanded by the beat of a tiny heart. And as the sun finally began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of violet, Elara knew which life mattered more. The servant put away her broom, the guardian prepared to climb. The transition from day to night in Greenhollow was not merely a shift in light, it was a shift in sound. As the sun sank behind the western ridge, the bleating of the sheep faded, replaced by the rhythmic chirping of crickets in the tall grass. The shouting of the shepherds died down, giving way to the low hoot of a scops owl hunting in the olive grove. The farm, a bustling engine of commerce by day, became a silent fortress of stone by night. Elara waited until the last lantern in the main house flickered out. She waited until the heavy breathing of the farm dogs slowed into the deep, twitching sleep of hunters dreaming of rabbits. Then she moved. She slipped through the gap in the dry stone wall behind the vegetable garden, her feet finding the familiar footholds in the dark. Once she was clear of the perimeter, she didn't walk, she ran. But this was not the frantic, terrified scramble of the night before. This was a run of liberation. The cool air rushed into her lungs, tasting of wild thyme and damp limestone. Her oversized coat flapped behind her like the wings of a clumsy bird. She felt light, without the broom in her hand, without the weight of Master Caleb's gaze on her back. She was weightless. The hill rose up to meet her. The path was steep, winding through patches of thorny burnet and sage, but Elara knew it now. She knew which rocks were loose and which roots were waiting to trip her. She navigated them with the grace of a mountain goat, her sandals barely making a sound on the hard-packed earth. "I'm coming," she whispered to the wind. "I'm coming." She reached the thicket of acacia that guarded the cave. It looked like a dark tangle of shadows against the starlit sky. She pushed through the thorns, not caring that they snagged the wool of her coat. "Barney!" Her voice echoed softly in the stone chamber. For a moment, there was silence. Then, a rustle of dry leaves, a soft scrape of hoof against rock, and then a sound that made Alara's heart execute a perfect somersault in her chest. Ma. It was weak, raspy, and sounded a bit like a squeaky gate hinge, but it was a greeting. Alara dropped to her knees, crawling into the back of the cave. Even in the gloom, she could see him. He was standing. He was wobbly, his legs trembling with the effort, but he was upright, his head turned toward the entrance, toward her. "You're up," she gasped, scrambling forward. "You clever, clever boy." She reached out and he didn't flinch. Instead, he took a step forward and pressed his cold, wet nose against her cheek. He smelled of earth and dried milk and the distinct, musky scent of sheep. But to Alara, it was the sweetest perfume in Galilee. She sat back on her heels, laughing softly as he began to investigate her pockets, nudging her waist with impatient little bumps. All right, you greedy thing," she scolded affectionately, pulling out the clay flask. "You have no manners, none at all. Just like Silas." She uncorked the flask. The feeding was less clumsy tonight. They had found a rhythm. She dipped, he suckled, dip, suckle. As he ate, Alara began to talk. At the farm, Alara spoke perhaps 20 words a day, mostly "yes, master," or "sorry, Martha." Her voice was a tool for obedience, rusting from disuse. But here, in the safety of the rock, the dam broke. Words poured out of her, a stream of consciousness that flowed as freely as the Jordan River. "You wouldn't believe the day I had." "Barney," she whispered, stroking his crusty ears. Martha was in a mood, a proper mood. She burned the flatbread black as coal on the bottom, and she blamed the wood. Can you imagine? Blaming the wood for being too hot. Barney paused in his suckling to sneeze, sending a spray of milk droplets onto Alara's hand. "Exactly," Alara nodded, wiping her hand on her coat. "That's what I thought too. And then Jonah. He's the one with the hair like a haystack. He almost tripped over the water bucket I set down. He called me a clumsy sparrow. Can you believe that? A sparrow." She leaned her head back against the cool stone wall, looking up at the slice of starry sky visible through the cave mouth. "I think I'd like to be a sparrow, though," she mused, her voice turning dreamy. "Or maybe a hawk. If I were a hawk, I'd build a nest way up here, on the highest crag, and I'd bring you... Well, hawks eat mice, and you wouldn't like that. I'd bring you the sweetest clover from the valley floor, the kind with the purple flowers that taste like honey." She looked down at the lamb. He had finished the milk and was now chewing tentatively on the sleeve of her coat. "You're not listening," she sighed, tugging her sleeve away gently. "You're just using me for wool." But she didn't mind. In fact, she loved it. She loved that he didn't care about her swept floors or her dirty face. He didn't care that she was an orphan with no last name. To him, she was simply the bringer of milk. She was the warmth. She was the centre of his universe. "You know," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "this cave isn't just a hole in the rock. It's a castle. Our castle. And that rock over there," she pointed to a jagged stalagmite, "that's the throne. And the acacia bush outside, that's the gatekeeper. He's very fierce. He has 1,000 swords to keep the wolves away." Barney let out a soft burp and collapsed onto his front legs, curling up into a muddy ball on the bed of leaves she had made. His eyes were drooping. Alara lay down next to him, careful not to crush him. The ground was hard, and the night air was growing colder, turning her breath into white ghosts. But she didn't feel the cold. She reached out and rested her hand on his flank. Under the hardened mud, she could feel the steady, rhythmic rise and fall of his breathing. It was a lullaby, more soothing than any song a mother could sing. "Sleep tight, little prince of the mud," she whispered. "The gatekeeper is watching. and I'm here." Outside, the wind whispered through the tall grass, a soft, sibilant sound like the earth hushing its children. Hush, shh, hush. Alara closed her eyes. For a few hours, the broom did not exist. The ledger did not exist. There was only the girl, the lamb, and the vast, starry silence of the wild, holding them both in its open hand. Hunger, Alara discovered, was not a silence. It was a noise. It was a low, grumbling complaint that started in the hollow of her stomach and echoed up into her ears, like the distant rolling of thunder. For 3 days now, the noise had been her constant companion, a secret roommate living inside her skin. It was mid-morning in the Greenhollow kitchen. The room was a torture chamber of delicious scents. Martha had just pulled a tray of barley loaves from the clay oven. The crusts were golden brown, cracking slightly as they cooled, releasing a cloud of steam that smelled of yeast and warm earth. On the stove, a pot of lentil stew simmered, seasoned with cumin and dried garlic, a rich, heavy aroma that made the mouth water. Alara stood by the sink, scrubbing the iron cauldron. Her arms felt heavy, like lead weights were strapped to her wrists. The scrubbing brush slipped in her grip. "Here," Martha said, her voice cutting through the steam. She slid a wooden bowl across the table. It contained the midday meal, a ladle of thick lentil stew and a generous hunk of the fresh bread. "Eat up," Martha commanded, wiping her floury hands on her apron. "You've been dragging your feet all morning. If Silas sees you moving that slow, he'll have you mucking out the pigsty." Alara stared at the food. Her stomach gave a violent lurch, demanding to be filled. The lentils were hot and savoury, the bread was soft. Every instinct in her body screamed to sit down and devour it. But then she thought of the cave. She thought of Barney. He was growing. The few drops of milk she skimmed from her morning porridge were no longer enough. Yesterday, he had bleated at her after the flask was empty, headbutting her hand, searching for more. His ribs were still too prominent under the muddy wool. He needed fat. He needed strength. And she had no milk to give him. Unless... Alara looked at the bowl. Then she looked at the heavy earthenware jug standing on the counter, the milk reserved for the master's table. She couldn't steal from the jug. Martha counted every drop. But there was another way. "Martha?" Alara asked, her voice sounding thin to her own ears. May I take this outside? The heat. It makes me a bit dizzy," Martha frowned, looking at Alara's pale face. "Go on then. Fresh air might put some colour in your cheeks, but bring the bowl back clean." Alara took the bowl and hurried out into the courtyard, past the main barn, and around the corner to the goat pen. Jonah, the boy with the haystack hair, was there, milking the nanny goats. He was whistling a tuneless melody, the milk hitting the pail with a rhythmic ching hiss. Ching hiss. Alara took a breath. This was dangerous. "Jonah?" He looked up, startled. "What? You're not supposed to be here." Alara held out her bowl of stew and the warm bread. "I'm not hungry," she lied. The lie tasted like ash. "I have a stomachache, but it's a waste of good food. I thought maybe you'd want it." Jonah's eyes widened. He was a growing boy of 12, perpetually starving. The smell of the cumin-spiced lentils hit him. "You're giving me your lunch?" he asked, suspicious. "What do you want for it?" "Nothing," Alara said quickly. Then she paused. "Well, maybe a drink? Of the milk? Just to settle my stomach." Jonah looked at the stew. He looked at the bread. It was a king's ransom for a shepherd boy. "Deal," he said, grabbing the bowl before she could change her mind. He shoveled a spoonful of lentils into his mouth, closing his eyes in bliss. "Here, take the ladle." He gestured to the pail of fresh, frothy goat's milk. Alara's heart hammered. She crouched down, shielding her movements with her body. She didn't drink. She pulled the clay flask from her sash, uncorked it, and submerged it in the warm, white foam. Glug, glug, glug. The flask filled. She corked it tight and hid it back in her clothes. Then, for good measure, she took a small sip from the ladle, just enough to coat her tongue. to fool her stomach into thinking help was coming. "Thanks, Jonah," she whispered. "You're crazy," he mumbled through a mouthful of bread. "But thanks." She walked away, her hands empty, her stomach roaring in protest. The hunger pangs were sharper now, biting like angry crabs. But against her ribs, the flask felt heavy. It felt warm. It felt like liquid gold. That evening, the climb to the ridge was harder than ever. Her legs trembled with every step. Her breath came in short, ragged gasps. The lack of food made the world tilt slightly at the edges, the horizon blurring into the grey twilight. The wind pushed against her, and for the first time, she felt like she might blow away like a dry leaf. But when she pushed through the acacia thorns, the weariness vanished. Barney was waiting. He was standing right by the entrance, his ears perked up. When he saw her, he let out a bleat that was stronger, deeper than before. He didn't wait for her to sit. He trotted over on legs that were becoming sturdy, bumping his head against her shin. I know, Elara gasped, collapsing onto the cave floor. She pulled out the flask. It was full to the brim. When she uncorked it, the smell of fresh milk filled the small space. She didn't use her finger tonight. She tipped the flask carefully, letting a small stream pour directly into his mouth. Barney drank greedily, his tail wiggling with a frantic, joyous energy. He gulped and swallowed, milk foaming around his dark muzzle. Elara watched him. Her own stomach cramped, a sharp, twisting pain. She swallowed dryly. She could have taken a sip. She could have saved half for herself. But then she looked at his flank. The hollows between his ribs were filling in. The skin, once loose and dry, was becoming taut. The energy radiating from him was palpable. He was growing. He was thriving. He was made of her sacrifice. Every drop of milk he drank was a piece of her lunch. Every ounce of weight he gained was an ounce she had lost. And as she watched him finish the last drop and lick his lips with a pink tongue, Elara felt a sensation that had nothing to do with food. She felt full. She reached out and stroked his head. The mud was still there, but beneath it, she could feel the heat of a strong, living body. "You're getting heavy. Barney," she whispered, a smile touching her pale lips. "Soon, you'll be too big for this cave." He burped, a loud, ungraceful sound, and collapsed into her lap, heavy and warm and satisfied. Elara leaned her head back against the stone. Her head spun slightly, a gentle vertigo. She was hungry, yes. She was dizzy, yes. But looking at the sleeping lamb, she realized that there were different kinds of starvation. And for the first time in her life, her heart was not the thing that was starving. Spring did not arrive in Greenhollow with a trumpet blast. It arrived with a whisper of green fire. Over the last few days, the brown, dormant hills had undergone a miraculous transformation. The rains of the past week had soaked deep into the limestone, waking seeds that had slept for a year. Now, a carpet of emerald fuzz covered the slopes, punctuated by the shocking scarlet of wild anemones and the delicate blue of speedwell. The air in the cave, usually cool and dry, had grown stuffy. It smelled of animal the musk and confined space. Elara sat at the entrance, her legs dangling over the ledge. The sun was high and warm, a benevolent hand pressing against her back. She looked at Barney. He was no longer the fragile, trembling scrap she had carried up the hill. He was sturdy. His legs, though still looking a bit too long for his body, had stopped wobbling. He was chewing enthusiastically on a dry twig he had found in the corner. But he was filthy. The mud from the birth night had not just dried, it had fossilized. It formed a hard, grey carapace around his middle. His tail was a heavy club of matted dirt that swung clumsily when he walked. He looked like a creature carved from the canyon floor, not a lamb of the pasture. "You itch, don't you?" Elara asked. Barney stopped chewing the twig. He reached back with his hind leg and scratched vigorously at his flank. letting out a frustrated grunt. "I thought so," Alara nodded. She stood up, dusting off her hands. "It's time. We can't have a prince looking like a mud pie." She knew a place. Not the main river where the flocks watered, that was too dangerous. But higher up, fed by the melting snows of Mount Hermon, there was a trickle of water that cut through the rocks. She called it the Silver Thread. It was a secret place, hidden by a grove of wild oleander bushes. "Come on," she whispered, making a clicking sound with her tongue. Barney looked at her, tilted his head, and then, miraculously, trotted after her. He didn't need a rope. He didn't need a shepherd's crook. He was tethered to her by something invisible and far stronger, the memory of milk. They moved through the high grass. Alara walked with her head swivelling like a watchful bird, scanning for the silhouette of a shepherd or the patrol of a dog. But the hills were empty. The main flocks were grazing in the lower valley today. They were alone in the wild cathedral of the highlands. The sound of the water reached them before the sight of it, a musical, bell-like tinkling, distinct from the rush of the wind. They pushed through the wall of oleanders, their pink flowers bright and toxic against the dark leaves. And there it was, a small pool, no wider than a wash basin, carved into the granite by centuries of falling water. It was crystal clear, the bottom lined with pebbles of quartz and jasper that glittered like jewels. Barney trotted to the edge and sniffed. He recoiled. The water smelled of cold stone. "It's just water," Alara said soothingly. She knelt by the pool and rolled up her sleeves. "It won't bite. Not like the fleas." She reached out and scooped a handful of water, splashing it gently onto Barney's back. He bleated in protest and skittered backward, his hooves clicking on the rocks. "Oh, stop it," Alara laughed, crawling after him. "You're a sheep, not a cat. You're supposed to like the outside." She caught him. He wasn't actually running away, just dancing out of reach, and pulled him close. She sat by the pool and hauled him into her lap. He was heavy now, a solid weight of bone and muscle. She cupped the water and poured it over the hardened mud. It took time. The earth was stubborn. It had baked into the wool, fusing with the fibres. Alara had no soap, so she used the fine sand from the stream bank, rubbing it gently against the crust. Splash, rub, splash, rub. The clear water of the pool began to turn a cloudy, swirling brown. A stream of silt drifted away, carried down the mountain. "Look at that," Alara murmured, working her fingers into a particularly thick clump on his shoulder. "You're turning the whole stream into chocolate." Barney stopped struggling. Perhaps the cool water felt good against his itchy skin, or perhaps the rhythmic motion of Alara's hands was hypnotic. He stood still, leaning his weight against her chest, letting out long, soft sighs. Alara worked with the concentration of a sculptor. She wasn't just washing him, she was excavating him. She scraped away the layers of the barn floor. She washed away the memory of the cold rejection. She scrubbed away the label of runt. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the armor began to crack. A chunk of dried mud fell away from his neck. Alara gasped, underneath the grey crust. The wool was not just clean, it was luminous. It was a white so pure it seemed to hold its own light, like the heart of a cloud or the foam of the sea. It was soft, crimped into tight, perfect curls that sprang back when she touched them. "Oh, Barney," she breathed. "Look at you." She rinsed the spot again. The contrast was startling. Against the rest of his dirty, matted fleece, that single patch of white shone like a star in a dark sky. She scrubbed harder, energized by the discovery. She cleaned his ears, gently wiping away the grime until the soft pink skin showed through. She washed his face, revealing a nose that was velvety and black, and eyes that were the colour of warm amber. She couldn't get it all. The mud on his belly and legs was too thick, too matted to remove without shears. But she had done enough. She had proven he was there. The sun was beginning to dip, casting long shadows across the water. The air grew cooler. "We have to go," Elara said, giving him a final squeeze. "You'll freeze if we stay." She stood up, her tunic soaked, her arms aching. Barney shook himself vigorously, sending a spray of water in all directions, a miniature rainstorm that made Elara shriek and laugh. He looked ridiculous, half brown, half white, wet and spiky. But to Elara, he was the most beautiful thing in creation. They walked back to the cave in the golden hour light. Barney pranced a little, feeling lighter without the weight of the dirt. As they reached the entrance of the cleft, Elara paused. She looked at the patch of white wool on his neck. It was a secret flag, a sign of what he truly was. "They didn't see you," she whispered to him, her hand resting on the clean spot. "They only saw the mud, but I see you. Barney, I see the white." He butted his head against her hand, demanding a scratch behind the ear. Elara smiled. She was wet, she was tired, and her stomach was beginning its familiar rumble. But as she crawled back into the shadows of the rock, she felt a profound sense of victory. She had begun the work of restoration. She had found the treasure hidden in the field, and tomorrow she would bring the shears. The cave, once a sanctuary of ample space and had begun to shrink. It wasn't that the stone walls were moving inward, but that the life inside them was expanding outward with explosive force. Barney was no longer a trembling invalid. He was a ball of kinetic energy wrapped in half-clean wool. He paced the small sandy floor, bumping into Elara's knees, chewing on the hem of her tunic, and letting out impatient bleats that echoed dangerously off the limestone ceiling. He wanted the world. "Shh, you noisy thing," Elara whispered up, placing a finger on his nose. "Do you want the eagles to hear you?" But looking at him, his legs twitching with the urge to run, his amber eyes bright with curiosity, she knew she couldn't keep him a prisoner of the dark any longer. A lamb was made for the green, not the grey. "All right," she decided, standing up. "But we have to go higher, where the shepherds never go." They left the cave earlier than usual, in the late afternoon, while the sun was still warm but the shadows were beginning to stretch, offering cover. Elara led him away from the path, scrambling up a steep embankment of loose shale that crumbled under her sandals. Barney followed with surprising agility, his hooves finding purchase where hers slipped. They crested the ridge and found it. It was a hidden plateau, a bowl of earth cupped in the hands of the mountain, invisible from the valley floor below, and it was alive. If the lower slopes were green, this meadow was a riot. The spring rains had turned it into a tapestry woven by a manic artist. There were wild red poppies, their petals like crumpled silk. There were tall stalks of yellow mustard flowers, swaying in the breeze like golden dancers. There were patches of purple clover and delicate white chamomile that released a sweet, apple-like scent when stepped upon. Barney stopped. He stared at the expanse. He'd only known the dark barn, the muddy pen, and the grey cave. He'd never seen colour before. He took a tentative step onto the grass. It was soft, yielding under his hooves. He lowered his head and took a bite of a clover flower. He chewed, eyes widening. It was sweet. It was juicy. It was infinitely better than the dry hay of the manger. Then the joy took him. It started as a twitch in his hindquarters. Then he exploded. He leaped into the air, all 4 feet leaving the ground at once. A stiff-legged vertical jump that defied gravity. He landed, spun around, and did it again. Bowing, Elara gasped, then covered her mouth to stifle a laugh. Barney took off running. He didn't run in a straight line. He ran in wild, ecstatic circles, bucking and twisting, his tail spinning like a propeller. He charged through a patch of yellow mustard, sending a cloud of pollen into the air like gold dust. He attacked a harmless butterfly, missed, and tumbled into the soft grass, only to pop back up instantly, ready for more. This was the gambol, the pure, unadulterated language of spring. It was a celebration of having legs that worked and lungs that could breathe. Elara watched him, Her hands pressed to her chest. A lump formed in her throat. But it wasn't a lump of sadness. It was the ache of a heart expanding to make room for joy. She forgot the farm. She forgot the broom. She ran into the meadow after him. "Catch me," she whispered loudly. She ran through the tall grass, the stalks whipping against her bare legs. Barney saw her and accepted the challenge. He chased her, bleating excitedly, his muddy white coat flashing through the greenery. They played until their lungs burned. Elara collapsed onto her back in a patch of sun-warmed clover, staring up at the sky. It was a deep, impossible blue, with high white clouds drifting lazily like sheep grazing on the firmament. Barney trotted over, panting, his pink tongue lolling out. He nudged her face, his breath smelling of sweet milk and crushed grass. Then, tired from his exertion, he collapsed beside her, pressing his warm side against her ribs. Elara lay there, listening to the hum of the bees and the distant song of a skylark. She felt the heat of the sun soaking into her bones, melting away the winter chill that had lived in her marrow for so long. She reached out and plucked a few daisy-like flowers growing near her hand. Her fingers, usually clumsy with cold or exhaustion, moved with a new dexterity. She wove the stems together, braiding them into a small circle. "Here," she murmured, sitting up. She placed the flower crown on Barney's head. It sat askew on his woolly brow, slipping slightly over one eye. He looked ridiculous. He looked like a king of the wild things. "King Barney of the High Meadow," she proclaimed softly. He chewed thoughtfully on a petal that dangled in front of his nose. Elara smiled. It was a smile that reached her eyes, crinkling the corners. For the first time, she didn't feel like an orphan. An orphan was someone who had nothing, but she had this. She had the sun, the secret meadow, and a muddy lamb wearing a crown of daisies. She looked at her hands. They were dirty, stained with grass and soil. But they were also the hands that had saved her life. "We're going to be okay," she whispered to the wind. "We're going to be okay." The sun began to dip toward the horizon, setting the sky on fire with streaks of apricot and violet. The air cooled instantly, a reminder that the world was still harsh, even in spring. "Come on, Your Majesty," Elara said, standing up and brushing the petals from her tunic. "The castle awaits." They walked back to the cave in the twilight. Moving slower now, Barney walked close to her leg, tired but content. As they descended the shale slope, leaving the healing meadow behind, Elara felt a new strength in her step. The fear of discovery was still there, lurking in the shadows of the valley below, but it no longer paralyzed her. She had tasted freedom. And like the taste of sweet clover, once you knew it, you could never forget it. Secrets have weight. They're not made of air, they're made of lead. And while a heart can soar with a secret, a body eventually begins to sag under the burden. For Elara, the double life was taking its toll. It had been 3 weeks since the night of the birth. 3 weeks of sleepless nights, of climbing the ridge in the dark, of hauling water and straw up steep goat tracks. 3 weeks of skimming milk and hiding bread. She was exhausted. It was mid-morning in the main courtyard. The sun was beating down with a surprising intensity, heating the cobblestones until they radiated warmth through the soles of Ilara's thin sandals. She was at the well, drawing water for the laundry. Creak, splash, heave. The rhythm was familiar, but her arms trembled as she pulled the heavy oak bucket up from the dark depths. Her face was paler than usual. The skin stretched tight over her cheekbones. There were dark bruises of fatigue under her eyes. Master Caleb stood on the porch of the main house, observing. He was a man who noticed things. A good shepherd had to be. He noticed when a ewe walked with a slight limp. He noticed when the wind shifted 2 degrees to the north. And lately, he had noticed a change in the girl. She was thinner, yes, but she was also distracted. Usually, Elara moved like a frightened mouse, scurrying heads down, terrified of being seen. but now there was a strange, distant look in her eyes. Sometimes, while sweeping, she would stop and look up at the ridge, a faint, secret smile playing on her lips. It was the smile that bothered Caleb. Servants didn't smile at nothing. He looked down at the ledger open on the table before him. He dipped his quill into the inkwell. Milk yield, down by 3 pints this week. Straw inventory, depleting faster than usual. These were small discrepancies. A spilled pail here, a wasteful bedding there. In a farm this size, they were usually negligible. But Caleb didn't become the wealthiest landowner in Greenhollow by ignoring the negligible. Silas, he called out, his voice low but carrying across the yard. The head shepherd, who was mending a hurdle near the gate, looked up and jogged over. Master? The girl, Caleb said, nodding slightly toward Ilara, who was struggling to pour the water into a large copper tub. Has she been doing her work? Silas scratched his beard, a sound like sandpaper on wood. Aye, mostly. She's slow in the mornings, walks around like she's wading through molasses, and Jonah says she's been eating like a bird. Caleb narrowed his eyes. Does she? But she's sweeping the upper loft, Silas added. No one's swept that dusty hole in years. She volunteered for it. The upper loft, Caleb repeated. The upper loft was where the old winter fodder was stored. It was far from the main barn, quiet and rarely visited. Caleb closed the ledger with a soft thud. Thank you, Silas. Get back to the hurdles. He waited until Ilara finished her task and disappeared into the laundry room with a bundle of linens. Then, Caleb stepped off the porch. He walked with a slow, deliberate gait toward the hay barn. The air inside was cool and dusty, filled with floating motes of gold in the shafts of sunlight. He walked to the ladder that led to the upper loft. He didn't climb it. He looked at the floor at the base of the ladder. The floor was earthen, packed hard by years of boots, but near the wall, where the shadows were deepest, the ground was softer. He crouched down. There, imprinted faintly in the dust, were marks. Not the heavy, hobnailed prints of a shepherd's boot, not the frantic scrabble of a rat. They were small footprints, a child's sandals, and next to them, barely visible, was something else. A smudge. A smear of dried mud that had fallen from a shoe or a hem. Caleb reached out and touched the smudge. He rubbed the dirt between his thumb and forefinger. It was gritty. It wasn't the dark, rich soil of the valley floor. It was grey clay, sticky and full of limestone dust, the kind of clay found high up on the ridges. He stood up, wiping his hand on his tunic. Why would the girl be climbing the ridges? There was nothing up there but rocks, thorns, and jackals. And why was she taking straw? Why was the milk missing? A suspicion began to form in his mind. It wasn't a fully formed picture yet, just an outline. Perhaps she was meeting someone, a runaway from another village, a thief hiding in the hills, or perhaps she was stealing to sell. His jaw tightened. He did not tolerate theft. He provided a roof, food, and safety. In return, he demanded loyalty. If the girl was biting the hand that fed her, he walked back out into the sunlight. Ilara had returned to the courtyard. She was hanging a wet sheet on the line, struggling against the breeze. The wet linen flapped around her, momentarily obscuring her from view. When the sheet fell back, she saw him. Caleb was standing 10 paces away, staring at her. He didn't say a word. He didn't frown. He just looked at her with those grey, unreadable eyes that weighed souls like wool on a scale. Ilara froze. The wooden clothespin slipped from her fingers and clattered onto the stones. For a long, terrifying moment, neither of them moved. The wind whispered between them, carrying the scent of drying hay and impending judgment. Then, Caleb turned and walked away toward the fields. Ilara let out a breath that was close to a sob. She bent down to pick up the clothespin, her hand shaking so badly she could barely grasp it. He knew. She didn't know what he knew, or how much. but she felt the weight of his suspicion pressing down on her like the atmospheric pressure before a storm. The safety of her secret world was cracking. She looked up at the distant ridge, where a small dot of white was waiting in a cave. "Be quiet tonight, Barney," she prayed silently. "Please, be quiet." The sunset that evening did not bleed gently into twilight. It was extinguished, as if a heavy hand had snuffed out a candle. Thick, bruised clouds rolled in from the west, blotting out the stars before they could even appear. The air grew heavy and still, charged with static electricity that made the hair on Alara's arm stand up. It was the kind of darkness that felt porous, as if things could step through it from other worlds. In the lower courtyard, the mood was grim. Usually, after the evening meal, the shepherds would gather around the fire pit, sharing a skin of wine and trading jokes about their dogs or their wives. But tonight, there was no laughter. The fire was kept low, just enough to warm hands, and the men sat close together, their faces etched with serious lines in the flickering orange light. Alara was scrubbing the dinner pots in the scullery, the window open to let out the steam. She paused, her hands submerged in the greasy water, straining to hear the voices drifting in from the yard. "I'm telling you, I saw the tracks," Silas was saying the surah, his voice a low rumble. "Down by the dry wadi, big as a man's hand, deep impressions." "A jackal?" asked Jonah, his voice cracking slightly. Silas spat into the fire. "Jackals are scavengers. They skulk. This was a wolf, and not just any wolf. The prints were uneven. The right foreleg is heavy." A chill that had nothing to do with the night air raced down Alara's spine. "The lame one," another shepherd whispered. "I thought he was dead. Master Caleb shot at him 2 winters ago." "He's back," Silas said grimly. "And a lame wolf is the most dangerous kind. He can't chase down the gazelles in the wild. He's too slow, so he looks for easy meat. He looks for the sick, the young, the penned. Easy meat." The pot slipped from Alara's soapy fingers and clattered back into the water with a loud splash. She gripped the edge of the stone sink, her knuckles turning white. Up on the ridge, inside the cave, there was no gate. There was no fire. There was only a wall of acacia thorns, sharp, yes, but brittle against the brute force of a starving predator. And Barney. Barney was fat now. He smelled of sweet milk and clover. To a wolf with a keen nose, he would smell like a feast laid out on a stone table. Alara dried her hands on her apron, her breath coming in shallow. Panicked gasps. She had to get up there. She had to bring him down, or stay with him, or build a fire. Something. She hurried out to the courtyard, trying to look invisible. "Where do you think you're going?" Master Caleb's voice stopped her dead in her tracks near the gate. He was standing by the equipment shed, holding a heavy iron lantern. Beside him, Bear and the other sheepdogs were pacing restlessly, their hackles raised, sensing the tension of their masters. I was just going to fetch more kindling, Master," Alara lied, pointing toward the wood pile near the outer wall. Caleb looked at her. In the gloom, his eyes were shadowed pools. "Leave it. Go inside. Bolt the doors." "But, did you not hear Silas?" Caleb's voice was sharp. "There's a predator in the valley. No one leaves the perimeter tonight. Not even the dogs run loose. We guard the main fold." He turned to the shepherds. "Double watch tonight. 2 men at the north gate, 2 at the south. Keep the fires high. If you see eyes, shoot." He slammed the heavy wooden bar across the main gate, locking the farm down. It was a siege. Alara stood paralysed. The walls of the farm, usually a symbol of safety, had suddenly become a prison. She was safe inside, yes. But her heart was outside, up on the dark, windswept hill, utterly unprotected. She was ushered back into the main house by Martha, who was muttering prayers and checking the shutters. "Get to bed, child," Martha said, her face pale. "And don't open the window, no matter what you hear. The wind plays tricks tonight." Alara climbed the ladder to the small loft where the servants slept. It was dark and stuffy. She lay down on her straw pallet, pulling the scratchy wool blanket up to her chin. She closed her eyes, but sleep was an impossibility. In her mind, she travelled the path. She saw the shale slope. She saw the acacia bush. She saw Barney, curled up on his bed of leaves, trusting her. He was waiting for his milk. He was waiting for the girl who had promised to return. What if he comes out? The thought terrified her. Barney was curious now. If she didn't come, if he got hungry, he might wander out of the cave. He might bleat for her. A bleat in the silence of the night would be a dinner bell for the lame one. Outside, the wind picked up. It howled around the corners of the stone house, sounding like voices. Help me. Help me. Elara squeezed her eyes shut, tears leaking out and sliding into her ears. She imagined the heavy tread of the wolf, the uneven limp Silas had described. Thump drag, moving up the hill, smelling the milk. She couldn't stay here. She couldn't just lie in the warmth while he was alone. But the doors were bolted. The dogs were alert. Master Caleb was prowling the yard like a lion himself. Then she remembered. The scullery window. The one she'd been standing at earlier. It was small. Too small for a man to fit through. But Elara was small. She was the runt, as Caleb had once called her. She sat up. The house was silent. Martha's deep breathing came from the room below. Elara slipped out of bed. She didn't put on her sandals, they would be too noisy on the wooden floorboards. She moved barefoot, a ghost in her own home. She reached the ladder and began to descend, testing each rung for creaks before committing her weight. Her heart was beating so hard she felt it in her throat. A frantic, fluttering bird. She wasn't stealing milk tonight. She wasn't stealing bread. She was stealing herself. She reached the bottom. The kitchen was dark and the embers in the hearth casting a dull red glow. She crept to the scullery. She pushed the shutter. It groaned softly. She froze, waiting. Silence. She pushed it wider. The night air rushed in, cold and smelling of ozone and fear. She climbed onto the stone sink. It was slippery with grease. She wiggled her shoulders through the opening. It was tight. The stone scraped her skin, catching her tunic. She pushed. Pop. She tumbled out onto the soft earth of the herb garden. She was out, but she was on the wrong side of the wall. She was still inside the farm perimeter. To get to the hill, she had to cross the open yard, past the fires, past the dogs, past Caleb. She crouched behind a rosemary bush, peering out into the courtyard. The fires were blazing. The shepherds stood like statues, spears in hand. The dogs were alert, their ears swivelling like radar dishes. It was impossible. There was no way to cross without being seen. But then, she looked up at the ridge. A jagged bolt of lightning, silent and distant, lit up the sky for a fraction of a second. In that flash, the hill looked jagged and hostile, a set of teeth waiting to close. She needed a distraction, or she needed a weapon. Her eyes fell on the equipment shed, just a few feet away from her hiding spot. The door was ajar. Inside, she knew, were the old tools, broken shears, coils of rope, and lanterns. An idea, desperate and dangerous, formed in her mind. If she couldn't sneak past the guards, perhaps she could make them look the other way. She took a breath, tasted the metallic tang of the storm and crawled toward the shed. The equipment shed was a tomb of forgotten things. It smelled of rust, dry rot, and the sharp, chemical tang of old lanolin oil. Elara crouched in the darkness, her knees pressed against a coil of hemp rope that felt as rough as tree bark. Outside, the wind battered the wooden walls, testing every plank for weakness. She needed two things. She needed a weapon, and she needed light. The mountain at night was a different beast than the mountain by day. It was a void. Without a light, one wrong step on the shale path could send her tumbling into a ravine. Her hands swept across the floor, groping blindly in the gloom. Her fingers brushed against cold metal, a harrow, teeth facing up. She recoiled. She moved further. She touched wood, a broken handle of a spade. Too heavy. Then, hanging low on a nail near the back wall, she found it. It was the old iron. A heavy, stormproof lantern that Master Caleb had stopped using years ago because the glass was thick and distorted the light. But it was sturdy. It could take a fall. She lifted it off the hook. It was heavy, pulling at her thin wrist. She shook it gently. Slosh. There was oil in the reservoir. Next to it, on a dusty shelf, she found a small tin box. She rattled it, the dry, rhythmic chick-chick-chick of lucifer matches. She shoved the tin into her sash and gripped the lantern's cold handle. Now, she just had to get out. Outside. The farm was a theatre of tension. She could hear the voices of the shepherds by the main gate, their words snatched away by the wind. "Hold steady," Silas roared. "Bear, down!" The dogs were going mad. They were barking at the north wall, throwing themselves against the stones, their claws scrabbling for purchase. They smelled something. The lame one was circling, testing the perimeter from the north. Ilara realised with a jolt that the wolf was inadvertently her accomplice. Every eye, every spear, every lantern was trained on the north gate. The south wall, the one behind the vegetable patch, was unguarded. It was now or never. She didn't run, she scurried, staying low to the ground, moving in the deep ink shadow of the shed. She darted across the open patch of ground. The wind whipped her hair across her face, blinding her, but she didn't stop to brush it away. She reached the south wall. It was built of dry stone, waist high for a man, but chest high for her. She set the lantern on the top stones. Then, digging her toes into the crevices, she hauled herself up. The rough stones scraped the skin off her palms. She grunted, swinging a leg over. For a second, she was silhouetted against the stormy sky, a small, dark shape perched on the boundary between safety and the wild. She dropped down the other side. The landing was hard. She twisted her ankle in the tall, wet grass, biting her tongue to suppress a cry. Pain shot up her leg, hot and sharp, but she ignored it. She grabbed the lantern from the top of the wall and scrambled into the darkness of the olive grove. She didn't light the lamp yet. That would be suicide. She had to put distance between herself and the farm. She ran blind. Branches whipped her face. Brambles tore at her tunic. She ran until her lungs burned and the sounds of the barking dogs faded into the roar of the wind. Back inside the perimeter, the chaos at the north gate subsided. The wolf, sensing the strength of the defence, had moved on, melting back into the shadows to find easier prey. The dogs ceased their frenzied barking and settled into low, throat-rumbling growls. Caleb lowered his spear. He wiped the rain mist from his face. "He's gone," Silas grunted, patting Bear's heaving flank. "Smart devil." "He won't attack the main fold." Caleb nodded. "Keep the watch. He might circle back." He turned and walked away from the gate. He was restless. The adrenaline of the potential attack was still coursing through his veins, making his senses hyper-aware. He felt an itch between his shoulder blades, the instinct that said something was out of place. He walked past the equipment shed. The door was swinging slightly in the wind. Kriak. Bam. Kriak. Bam. He frowned. He was a man of order. He never left doors unlatched. He stepped inside, raising his own bright lantern high. The light flooded the small, cluttered space, chasing away the shadows. His eyes scanned the familiar inventory. The coils of rope, the broken spade, the harrows. His gaze stopped at the back wall. There was a nail, a rusty, bent nail driven into the wood. Below it, on the dusty floor, was a clean, rectangular outline in the dust where something had sat for years. And the nail was empty. The old iron lantern was gone. Caleb stood perfectly still. The wind howled outside, but in his mind, The pieces of the puzzle were clicking together with the precision of a trap snapping shut. The missing milk, the stolen straw, the tracks on the ridge, the distracted girl, and now a missing lantern on the night of a wolf hunt. This was not just theft. This was madness. "Elara," he whispered, the name tasting like grit in his mouth. He didn't go to the servants' loft to check if she was in bed. He knew she wouldn't be. He strode out of the shed. He didn't call for Silas. He didn't call for the dogs. This was not a matter for the farmhands. This was a matter between the master of the house and the rebellious child he'd taken in. He went to the woodpile and grabbed his walking staff, a heavy rod of seasoned oak, polished by years of grip. He checked the oil in his own lantern. It was full. He walked to the south wall. He saw the scrape marks on the mossy stones where small feet had scrambled over. He looked out into the pitch-black night, toward the jagged silhouette of the ridge. Somewhere out there, in the storm and the dark, a foolish girl was walking straight into the jaws of death. Caleb vaulted the wall with the ease of a man half his age. He did not run. He walked with a long, devouring stride. He was not hunting a wolf anymore. He was hunting a thief. And he intended to catch her before the lame one did. The chase had begun. The olive grove offered a brief, deceptive shelter. The twisted trunks of the ancient trees, gnarled like the hands of old men, broke the wind, creating pockets of relative calm. Elara leaned against a trunk, her chest heaving. Her ankle throbbed with a dull, hot rhythm that synced with her heartbeat. She fumbled for the tin box in her sash. Her hands were shaking so badly that the first match snapped in two. The second one flared, a brief hiss of sulphur that illuminated her terrified eyes before the wind snuffed it out. "Please," she whimpered, shielding the third match inside her coat. Strike. A tiny tongue of blue-orange flame appeared. She lowered it quickly to the wick of the old iron lantern. The oil caught, the flame jumped, stabilized, and grew. She closed the glass door. The thick, uneven glass of the old lantern cast a strange, distorted light, a bruised yellow halo that threw monstrous shifting shadows against the tree trunks. But it was light. She stepped out of the grove and onto the lower slopes of the ridge. Immediately, the mountain declared war. The path to the cleft was known as the Goat's Spine for a reason. It was narrow, littered with loose scree and flanked by a drop that disappeared into the blackness of the ravine. In the daylight, it was treacherous. In the storm, it was a death trap. The wind here didn't just blow, it pummeled. It came screaming down the funnel of the valley, tearing at Elara's clothes, trying to peel her off the rock face. It carried rain now, hard, stinging pellets that felt like gravel against her skin. Elara bent double, clutching the lantern with both hands to keep it from swinging. She moved crabwise, keeping her centre of gravity low. Step, drag, step, drag. Her bad ankle screamed in protest every time her weight shifted onto it, but she bit her lip until she tasted blood. The pain was good. The pain kept her awake. The pain was the price of the ticket. "I'm coming, Barney," she shouted into the gale, though the wind snatched the words away before they left her mouth. "Hold on." Half a mile below, a different kind of force was moving up the hill. Master Caleb did not scramble. He climbed with the grim, inexorable rhythm of a machine. He knew this mountain. He had walked its spine since he was a boy. He knew which rocks were solid and which were deceivers. He didn't need to look at his feet. His eyes were fixed on the single, wavering point of light far above him. It looked like a firefly caught in a hurricane, bobbing, dipping, struggling against the dark. "Foolish child," he muttered, his voice swallowed by the thunder. "You'll kill yourself for a few coins." He was angry. The anger burned in his gut, a cold, hard knot. He had given her home. He had given her safety, and she had rejected it for the wild. He gripped his oak staff tighter, using it to vault over a cluster of boulders. He was gaining on her. Up ahead, the path turned steep, becoming less of a trail and more of a scramble. Elara dropped to her knees. It was safer this way. She hooked the lantern handle through her elbow, ignoring the way the metal bit into her arm. She clawed at the wet earth, pulling herself up. The mud slicked her hands. Her tunic was soaked through, clinging to her shivering frame like a second skin. Her hair was plastered to her skull, rain dripping into her eyes, blurring her vision. She was crying now, but she didn't know it. The tears mixed with the rain, salty and indistinguishable. Why is it so far? She thought desperately. It was never this far before. The mountain seemed to be growing, stretching itself out to keep her from her destination. Every shadow looked like a wolf. Every rustle of the brush sounded like a paw step. Then, disaster. Her hand reached for the rock hold, a sturdy-looking chunk of limestone. She pulled. The rock came loose. With a sickening lurch, Elara fell backward. She scrabbled frantically, her fingernails tearing against the slate. She slid 5 feet, 10 feet, tumbling toward the edge of the drop. "No!" she screamed. Her foot caught on a gnarled root of a scrub oak. The jolt nearly dislocated her hip, but it stopped her fall. She lay there, dangling half off the path, her breath sobbing in her throat. The lantern. It had flown from her arm. It tumbled down the slope and came clattering against the stones. Clang, clang, smash. But it didn't go out. The old iron lived up to its name. It came to rest in a patch of thorny burnet, lying on its side, the flame still flickering stubbornly inside its cage. Elara stared at it. It was 10 feet below her. She looked up. The cleft was still above, hidden in the dark. She looked down, far below, much closer than she expected. She saw another light. It was steady. It was bright, and it was moving up the path with terrifying speed. A jolt of pure adrenaline shot through her. It wasn't the wolf. Wolves didn't carry lanterns. It was him. Panic, cold and absolute, seized her. If he caught her now, he would drag her back. He would lock her in the cellar. And Barney would be left alone in the storm. A meal for the lame one. She couldn't go back for the lantern. It would take too long. She scrambled to her feet, ignoring the agony in her ankle. She turned her back on the light, on the warmth, on the safety. She faced the mountain in the dark. I can see, she lied to herself. I can see enough. She began to climb again, using her hands as eyes, feeling the rock, trusting the memory of her feet. She crawled blindly into the teeth of the storm, fueled by a terrifying love that was stronger than her fear of the dark. Below her, Caleb reached the spot where she'd fallen. He stopped. He saw the old iron lantern lying in the bushes, glowing faintly. He saw the slide marks in the mud. He saw the single small sandal that had come loose in the fall. He picked up the sandal. It was worn, the leather thin, patched clumsily with twine. He looked up into the black void where the girl had vanished. The anger in his gut shifted, twisted into something else. Something that felt uncomfortably like fear. "Elara!" he roared, his voice booming over the wind. "Stop! You'll fall." But the wind took his voice and threw it down into the valley. And from the darkness above, there was no answer, only the sound of falling stones. Caleb stood in the rain, the small, muddy sandal resting in his palm like a fallen sparrow. It was impossibly light. The leather was worn paper thin at the heel, and the twine stitching was fraying. It was a testament to poverty, to miles walked on hard stone floors, to a life lived in the margins of his own abundance. He shoved the sandal into his deep pocket. He gripped his oak staff until the wood groaned under the pressure of his hand. "Stubborn," he hissed into the wind. "Stubborn, foolish girl." But the anger that had fueled his ascent was cooling, replaced by a cold, crawling dread. He looked up at the slope. Without a light, that path was a death sentence. And yet, she'd kept going. She hadn't turned back to the lantern. She hadn't cried out for help. She'd crawled upward into the teeth of the gale. Why? People ran away from fear. They ran away from storms. They ran towards safety. Elara was running toward the nothingness, unless the nothingness held something that mattered more to her than her own life. Caleb raised his lantern. The beam cut a cone of yellow light through the driving rain. "I'm coming for you," he growled. He resumed the climb. He did not move with Elara's frantic, scrambling desperation. He moved with the power of a man who owned the earth beneath his boots. He planted his feet wide, finding the stable bedrock beneath the shifting mud. He used his staff as a third leg, anchoring himself against the wind gusts. He tracked her. It wasn't hard. In the slick mud, her struggle was written clearly. Here, a handprint where she'd clawed the earth. There, a patch of crushed time where she had slipped. He climbed for 10 minutes, the rain soaking his beard and plastering his tunic to his chest. He was closing the distance. Then he stopped. He lowered the lantern, shielding the glass with his body to keep the glare from blinding him. He sensed it before he saw it. A change in the air. A smell that was not rain, nor wet stone. It was the smell of wet fur and old blood. Caleb slowly turned his head to the right, toward a cluster of jagged boulders that overlooked the path. 2 points of phosphorescent green fire were floating in the darkness. They were unblinking. They were watching the path above, the lame one. The wolf was huge, a shadow darker than the night. He was standing motionless on the rock, ignoring the man below. His attention was fixed on the scent trail of the bleeding, stumbling girl ahead. He knew she was hurt. He knew she was alone. He was waiting for her to stop moving. Caleb's heart hammered a warning rhythm against his ribs. He had his staff. He had his knife. He could fight the beast. But if he fought the wolf here, the noise would scatter the creature, sending it running. Perhaps running straight up the path. Or worse, if he delayed, the wolf would simply circle around him. The beast was lame, but he was cunning. He knew the shortcuts. Caleb realized with a jolt of horror that he was not hunting a thief anymore. He was racing an executioner. "No," Caleb breathed. He didn't shout at the wolf. He didn't throw a stone. He did the only thing that would matter. He broke into a run. It was a reckless, dangerous pace for a man of his age on a wet mountain. He slipped, his knee slamming into a rock, but he scrambled up, ignoring the pain. He swung the lantern wildly, not caring about the shadows it cast. He had to get to her first. Underscore 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 high above. Elara had reached the thicket. She was crawling on her hands and knees. Her left foot was bare, numb from the cold mud. Her hands were raw, bleeding from a dozen small cuts where the slate had sliced her skin. She couldn't hear the wolf. She couldn't hear Caleb. The wind in the acacia thorns sounded like 1,000 screaming voices, drowning out the world. She reached the gap in the bushes. The thorns grabbed at her coat, tearing the wool, scratching her face. She didn't feel it. She pushed through. The cave mouth yawned before her, a blacker darkness within the dark. "Barney," she choked out. Her voice was a broken thing, a whisper of smoke. She collapsed onto the sandy floor of the entrance. She was inside. She was out of the wind. But the silence terrified her. Usually, he would be at the entrance. He would hear her coming. He would be bleating. There was no sound from the back of the cave. "Barney!" she cried louder, panic giving her a surge of strength. She dragged herself forward, her hands groping in the blackness. "Where are you?" Her hand brushed against the bed of dry leaves she had made. It was empty, cold. Elara stopped breathing. The world spun around her. Had he wandered out? Had he fallen? Then a flash of lightning illuminated the cave for a heartbeat. He was there. He was pressed into the deepest, furthest crevice of the rock wall, as far back as he could go. He was shaking so violently that his teeth were rattling. His ears were pinned back flat against his head. He wasn't looking at Alara. He was staring past her, at the entrance, at the darkness she had just come through. He knew. Animals know before men do. He smelled the predator on the wind long before Alara had even started her climb. He had been cowering in the dark, waiting for the monster to come. "Oh, baby," Alara sobbed, scrambling over to him. She threw her arms around his neck, pulling his trembling body against hers. He buried his face in her wet coat, letting out a low, terrified whimper. "I'm here," she whispered fiercely, rocking him. "I'm here. I won't let him get you. I won't." But as she held him, she looked back at the entrance. The acacia bush was thrashing in the wind, and beyond it, the path was open. She had no weapon. She had no fire. She had no door. She only had her body. Alara made a choice. She moved. She didn't retreat further into the cave. Instead, she dragged herself and the lamb toward the narrowest part of the entrance passage. She sat down, her back against one wall, her feet braced against the other. She pulled Barney behind her, shoving him into the space between her back and the rock. "Stay," she commanded. She faced the opening. She picked up a stone, a jagged piece of limestone the size of an apple. It was pathetic. It was nothing, but it was all she had. She sat there, a small, shivering figure in the dark, guarding her treasure. And then she heard it. Not the wind, not the rain, the sound of heavy breathing, the scritch-scratch of claws on stone. Something was coming through the thorns. The seconds stretched out, thin and brittle as spun glass. Alara gripped the limestone rock until the jagged edges cut into her palm, mingling her warm blood with the cold dampness of the stone. She did not feel the pain. Pain was a signal from a body that expected to live, and Alara had stopped expecting. She focused entirely on the gap in the acacia thorns. The storm outside had paused to take a breath. The rain slackened, and the wind dropped to a low, menacing murmur. In that sudden, drowning silence, the sounds from outside became magnified. Sniff. It was a wet, sucking sound, heavy lungs pulling in the air, tasting it. Snap. A dry twig breaking under a heavy paw. The smell hit her first. It wasn't just the smell of wet fur, it was a stench of old meat, of musk, of something ancient and hungry that had walked out of the nightmares of the valley. It drifted through the thorns, cloying and thick, filling the small cave. Barney, pressed behind her back, went rigid. He didn't make a sound. His instinct, deep and ancestral, told him that to move was to die. Alara stared into the gloom. Through the tangled web of black branches, she saw them, 2 points of pale, greenish light. They were low to the ground. They were unblinking. They were set wide apart. The eyes of the lame one. He was there. He was right outside the thin barrier of thorns. He had found them. A low growl started, not in the air, but in the earth. It vibrated through the floor of the cave, travelling up through Alara's legs and into her chest. It was a sound of pure possession. Mine. Alara's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. Frantic and bruising, every nerve in her body screamed at her to scramble back, to squeeze deeper into the rock, to hide. But she didn't move backward. She shifted her weight forward. She raised the rock in her trembling hand. "Go away," she whispered. Her voice was a broken squeak. The eyes blinked once. The growl deepened, turning into a wet, rumbling chuckle. The wolf knew she was there. He knew she was small. He knew she was prey. He took a step forward. The acacia bushes rustled violently as his heavy shoulder pushed against them. The thorns tore at his hide But he didn't care. He was pushing through. Alara saw the outline of a massive head, blacker than the night. pushing into the gap. She saw the flash of white teeth, yellowed at the gums. Then he threw his head back. The howl did not start low, it erupted. It was a jagged, tearing sound that ripped the night apart. It was a song of ice and hunger, a declaration of death that echoed off the canyon walls, bouncing back and forth until the whole world seemed to be screaming. The sound paralyzed Alara. It turned her blood to slush. It stripped away her humanity and left her as just another small, shivering animal in the dark. Barney convulsed behind her, letting out a sharp bleat of terror. That sound, the cry of the lamb, snapped the spell. The wolf lunged. He threw his weight against the thorns, snapping branches. He was coming in. "No!" Alara screamed. It was a primal scream, tearing her throat raw. She didn't throw the rock. She would only get one chance. She scrambled onto her knees, making herself a shield. She spread her arms wide, blocking the narrow passage to the back of the cave. "You can't have him!" she shrieked, tears streaming down her face. "You can't have him!" the wolf snarled, his muzzle pushing through the final layer of brush, his hot breath hitting her face. He was 3 feet away. She could see the scar running down his nose. She could see the saliva dripping from his jowls. She squeezed her eyes shut. She raised the stone high. She waited for the teeth. Flash. A blinding light exploded outside the cave. It wasn't lightning. It was fire. And with the light came a roar. Not the howl of a beast, but the bellow of a man. "Get back!" The voice was thunder. It was the voice of judgment. There was a sickening thud, the sound of heavy oak striking muscle and bone. The wolf yelped, a high, startled sound that didn't fit its size. The green eyes vanished. The presence in the thorns was ripped away. Outside, chaos erupted. The sounds of a struggle. The scrambling of claws on loose shale. A heavy object striking the earth. And the roaring of the man, again and again. "Begone! Ya!" Lara opened her eyes. She was blinded by the afterimage of the light. She was shaking so hard her teeth chattered, the stone slipping from her numb fingers. Silence returned to the entrance. Heavy, heaving silence. Then the sound of footsteps. Not the soft pad of a paw, but the heavy crunch of boots. The acacia bushes were wrenched apart by a strong hand. A lantern was thrust into the opening. The light was harsh, yellow, and unyielding. It flooded the small cave, exposing every secret. It lit up the bed of dry leaves. It lit up the muddy walls. And it lit up the girl. Alara was kneeling in the dust, her arms still spread wide in a gesture of protection. Her tunic was soaked and muddy. Her hair was wild. Her face was a mask of dirt and tears. And behind her, peeking out from the shelter of her small, broken body, was the white face of a lamb. The figure behind the lantern stopped. He didn't speak. He just stood there, his chest heaving, blocking the wind, blocking the wolf, blocking the world. Alara looked up, squinting against the glare. She couldn't see his face, only his silhouette. He looked like a giant. He looked like the mountain itself had come to claim her. She didn't try to run. There was nowhere to go. She simply curled her fingers into the wool of the lamb behind her, lowered her head, and waited for the punishment to begin. The silence in the cave was heavier than the storm. It was a physical weight, pressing against the eardrums, broken only by the ragged, heaving breaths of the man standing in the entrance. Master Caleb lowered the lantern. His hand was trembling, not from fear, but from the adrenaline of the kill that hadn't happened. He gripped his oak staff in the other hand, the wood dark with rain. He stared. For weeks, he had built a monument of suspicion in his mind. He had imagined a thief. He had imagined a rebellious servant selling his property to peddlers. He had imagined betrayal. He was ready to shout. He was ready to drag the girl back by her ear and lock her in the cellar until she learned the value of obedience. The words of reprimand were already forming on his tongue, sharp and bitter as gall. "You foolish, wicked child," he began. his voice a low growl that vibrated in the small space. "Do you know what you have done? You have risked your life for—" The sentence died in his throat. It simply evaporated, because the light of the lantern, swinging slightly in his grip, finally stabilized. And for the first time, Caleb truly saw what was in front of him. He saw Elara. She was not cowering in guilt. She was terrified. Yes, her eyes were wide sources of liquid fear, but her posture was not one of surrender. She was on her knees, her body angled forward. Her arms were spread wide, stretched to their limit, creating a human barrier. And behind her, pressed against the stone, was the lamb. Caleb's eyes narrowed. He recognized the creature. It was the runt, the twisted thing from Pen 5, the garbage he had ordered to be discarded 3 weeks ago. It should be dead. It should be a pile of bones in the ravine, but it was alive. It was not just alive, it was substantial. Even under the layer of dried mud that coated its fleece, Caleb could see the roundness of its belly. He could see the strength in its neck as it peered around Elara's hip. But it was the picture that struck Caleb with the force of a physical blow. He was a religious man, in the way that people in Greenhollow were religious, by habit and tradition. He went to the synagogue. He knew the Psalms. He knew the image of the Good Shepherd. It was painted on the wall of the village chapel, a tall, strong man carrying a lamb fighting off lions. But looking at this shivering, dirty, malnourished orphan girl, Caleb realised he'd never understood the image until this moment. The shepherd wasn't the man with the big staff. The shepherd was the one who stood between the wolf and the weak. Elara was bleeding. There was a scratch on her cheek where a thorn had caught her. Her knees were raw from the rocks. She was freezing. Yet, she had thrown herself in front of the beast. Caleb felt a sudden, dizzying shift in his chest. The anger that had fueled him up the mountain drained away, leaving a hollow ache in its place. He felt giant and clumsy and ashamed. He took a step forward. Elara flinched violently, squeezing her eyes shut. Bracing for the blow, she pulled the lamb tighter against her back. "Don't hurt him," she whispered. "Please, beat me, but don't hurt him." The words cut Caleb to the bone. "Elara," he said. His voice was different. The gravel was gone. It was hoarse, unsteady. He knelt. The movement was slow and stiff. The master of Greenhollow did not kneel in the dirt, but he knelt now. He set the lantern on the ground between them. He reached out a hand. Elara pulled back, a whimper escaping her throat. "Hush," Caleb said softly. "I'm not going to strike you." He didn't reach for her. He reached past her shoulder. His large, rough hand, calloused from 40 years of labour, hovered over the lamb. The lamb sniffed his fingers. He smelled the sheep scent on the man. He didn't pull away. Caleb touched the fleece. It was hard and crusty with the old mud of the cave. But his fingers dug deeper, past the surface, down to the skin. He felt the warmth, the heat of a living, thriving body. He parted the wool with his thumbs. There, at the roots, where the new growth had pushed out over the last 3 weeks of care, the wool was not brown. It was not grey. It was white. It was a blinding, pristine white, soft as silk, fed by the milk Elara had stolen, nurtured by the warmth she had given. It was the white of resurrection. Caleb stared at the white roots. He remembered the missing milk. He remembered the bread Elara hadn't eaten. He remembered the hollows in her own cheeks. She had poured her own life into this refuse. She had decreased so that he might increase. Caleb pulled his hand back. He looked at his own fingers. Then he looked at Elara's face. He saw the streaks of dirt, the tears, the fierce, defiant love in her eyes. He remembered the verse he hadn't thought of in years. He shall gather the lambs with his arm and carry them in his bosom. He had built barns. He had amassed flocks. He had balanced the ledgers. But up here, in a hole in the rock, a child had done the work of God. A A tear, hot and surprising, leaked from the corner of Caleb's eye and tracked through the dust on his cheek. "He's not muddy," Caleb whispered, his voice thick. "Not underneath." Elara opened her eyes, confused. She looked at the master. She didn't see the tyrant she expected. She saw an old man kneeling in the dirt, looking at a sheep as if it were a treasure. He's Barney," she stammered. "Barney," Caleb repeated, tasting the name. "Son of encouragement." He looked at Elara. He looked at the lantern light reflecting in her dark eyes. "And you," he said gently, "are a shepherd." He didn't say servant. He didn't say girl. He gave her the title that belonged to kings and prophets. Caleb reached out again, but this time he took Elara's hand. Her fingers were ice cold, small and fragile in his grip. He squeezed them, rubbing his thumb over her knuckles to bring back the blood. "The wolf is gone, Elara," he said firmly, "and he is not coming back. I promise you." He stood up, groaning slightly with the effort. He picked up the lantern. The light shifted, pushing back the shadows of the cave, making the space feel less like a trap and more like a shelter. "Come," he said, extending his hand down to her. "It is time to bring the flock home." Elara stared at the hand. It was the hand that held the cane. It was the hand that held the ledger. But now, it was open. Slowly, hesitantly, she reached up. The cave was small, but the moment was vast. Elara took Master Caleb's hand. Her fingers, stained with the grey clay of the mountain, disappeared into his large, calloused palm. He pulled her up, not with a jerk, but with a steady, leverage-based strength, like a man raising a fallen fence post. She stood on wobbling legs, shivering violently as the adrenaline began to drain from her system, leaving only the cold behind. Caleb looked at her. He saw the way her teeth chattered, the way her wet tunic clung to her ribs. He let go of her hand for a moment and reached for the clasp of his outer cloak. It was a heavy garment, made of thick, felted wool dyed a deep indigo, lined with sheepskin. It was the coat of a master, designed to withstand the biting frosts of the Galilean winter. He unhooked the bronze clasp at his throat. With a heavy swish, he swung the cloak off his shoulders. The heat of his body was still trapped in the fibres. He draped it over Elara. The weight of it nearly knocked her over. It fell to her ankles, swallowing her completely. It smelled of wood smoke, old leather, and safety. The warmth hit her instantly, a physical embrace that made her gasp. "Button it," Caleb commanded gently. While Elara fumbled with the oversized toggles, Caleb turned his attention to the corner. Barney was still pressed against the rock, watching the man with wide, suspicious amber eyes. He let out a low, warning bleat when Caleb approached. "Peace, little one," Caleb murmured. He didn't grab the lamb. He slid his hands under its belly and chest, lifting it with a practiced motion. He hefted the animal, testing its weight. "He's heavy," Caleb noted, a note of surprise in his voice. "Solid." He tucked the muddy creature under his left arm, holding him tight against his side. Barney squirmed for a second, then, sensing the strength of the hold and the absence of malice, went limp. "The path is slick," Caleb said, picking up his lantern with his right hand. "Stay close to my hip. Step where I step." They walked out of the cave. The storm had broken. The clouds were tearing apart like wet paper, revealing patches of a deep, star-studded violet sky. The moon, a bright, polished coin, was fighting its way through the mist. The air was scrubbed clean, smelling of ozone, wet pine and crushed sage. They passed the acacia bush. The thorns were broken and trampled where the wolf had forced his way through. Caleb paused, looking at the large paw prints in the mud, deep depressions that filled with water. He looked at the prints, then he looked at the girl wrapped in his cloak. She stood here, he thought, with a rock, a memory, sharp and sudden, pierced him. It was not a memory of the farm, or the ledgers, or the market. It was a memory of 40 years ago. He was 10 years old and alone on the lower ridge for the first time with his father's flock. A jackal had come, He had been terrified, weeping in the dark, armed only with a stick. He had run away. He had left a straggler behind. He had spent his whole life building walls, buying dogs, and hiring men so he would never have to feel that terror again. He had built a fortress of efficiency to hide the frightened boy he once was. And here was this girl, this runt, who had stood her ground. She possessed the one thing his wealth couldn't buy. She possessed a heart that feared loss more than it feared death. "Master?" Ilara's voice was muffled by the collar of the coat. Caleb shook his head, clearing the memory. "Walk." They began the descent. It was a slow procession. Caleb moved like a tank, breaking the wind, his boots crushing the loose shale into a stable path. Ilara followed in his wake. The lantern swung in Caleb's hand, casting a pendulum of light that revealed the treacherous drop-offs. Now that she could see the edge, Ilara felt a wave of nausea. "I climbed this in the dark." They reached the spot where she'd fallen. The old iron lantern was still there, lying in the burnet bush. The flame had finally sputtered out, drowning in the oil that had leaked onto the wick. Caleb stopped. He shifted the lamp to his shoulder, freeing a hand to reach down and pick up the old lantern. He hooked it onto his belt. "I looked for you," Ilara whispered, the words slipping out before she could stop them. "When I fell, I looked for the light." Caleb didn't look back, but his shoulders stiffened. "I was coming," he said gruffly. "I was just slow." They continued down. The lamb, lulled by the rhythmic motion of Caleb's stride, rested its muddy chin on the master's shoulder. It watched Ilara following behind, blinking slowly. As they reached the olive grove, the terrain levelled out. The tension of the high wire act evaporated, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion. Caleb stopped under the shelter of an ancient tree to adjust his grip. The lamb was getting heavier with every step. "He needs shearing," Caleb observed, looking at the matted, clay-caked fleece. "I washed him," Ilara said defensively, pulling the coat tighter. "In the high stream, underneath. He's white. I promise." "I know," Caleb said. He looked at her. "You have done a good job, Ilara. Better than some of my hired men." Ilara stopped breathing. A compliment from Master Caleb was as rare as snow in harvest. It felt heavier than the coat. "I stole the milk," she confessed. The secret had to come out. It was scraping the inside of her throat. And the bread, and the straw. "I know," Caleb repeated. Are you going to send me away?" The wind rustled the olive leaves, a dry, whispering sound like parchment turning. Caleb looked at the girl. He saw the way she stood, bracing herself for rejection, just as the lamb had braced itself against the rock. He realized that the farm had been a place of feeding bodies, but starving souls. "Send you away?" Caleb asked, his voice low. "Where would I find another shepherd who climbs mountains in a storm?" He turned and started walking again toward the farm walls. "We will discuss the price of the milk later," he called back over his shoulder. "But tonight, the accounts are closed." Ilara stood for a moment, stunned. Then, she scrambled to catch up, her small feet splashing in the puddles, following the large, steady footprints of the man who carried her heart in his arms. Down in the valley, the dogs began to bark, not in warning, but in greeting. They were coming home. The return to the walls of the farm was not a march of triumph, it was a stumble towards sanctuary. Ilara's legs, fueled for so long by the sheer terror of adrenaline, had turned to water. The oversized coat dragged in the mud, heavy and sodden, pulling at her shoulders. Every step was a negotiation with gravity. They reached the south wall, the place where she'd scrambled over in her desperation hours ago. It seemed like a lifetime had passed. The stone wall looked different now, less like a prison and more like a fortress arm outstretched to gather them in. "We go through the gate," Caleb said, his voice rumbling against the chest of the lamb he carried. "We do not climb like thieves." They walked around the perimeter to the main entrance. The massive oak doors were barred shut, a barrier against the night and the wolf. "Open!" Caleb roared. The sound of the dogs erupted instantly, a cacophony of barks and yelps from the other side. Then, the heavy scrape of the iron bar being lifted. The gates groaned inward. Silas stood there, a torch in one hand and a spear in the other. Behind him, the other shepherds were gathered, their faces pale and drawn, expecting the worst. They expected the master to return with a body, or perhaps to return alone. What they saw silenced the dogs. Master Caleb, the stern lord of Greenhollow, walked into the light. He was soaked to the bone, his beard dripping with rain. His fine tunic was stained with the grey clay of the high ridge, and in his arms, held against his chest with a tenderness usually reserved for his own grandchildren, was a muddy, matted lump of a sheep. Trailing behind him, dwarfed by the master's own indigo cloak, was the girl. She looked like a small, drowned bird wearing the feathers of an eagle. Silas lowered his spear. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. He stared at the bundle in Caleb's arms. He recognised the twisted leg dangling down. He recognised the peculiar, mismatched ears. "The runt," Silas breathed, disbelief colouring his voice. "Master, you went into the storm for the refuse?" Caleb stopped in the centre of the courtyard. The torchlight flickered over the group, casting long, dancing shadows on the wet cobblestones. "Refuse?" Caleb repeated softly. He looked at Silas. He looked at the shepherds who had laughed at the waste of milk 3 weeks ago. "Come here, Silas," Caleb commanded. The big shepherd stepped forward, confused. "Look," Caleb said. He shifted the lamb slightly, exposing the neck, the spot where Alara had scrubbed away the mud in the mountain stream. "Bring the torch close." Silas leaned in. The orange light of the flame illuminated the fleece. The outer layer was indeed a disaster, a crust of brown earth and matted filth. But Silas, a man who had shorn 10,000 sheep, knew where to look. He looked at the skin. He looked at the inch of new growth. He gasped. "It's clean," Silas whispered. "It is silver," Caleb corrected. "It is the finest wool this farm has ever produced. It is strong, it is dense, and it is white as the snow on Hermon." He looked around the circle of men. "We judged the book by its cover," Caleb said, his voice carrying to the back of the crowd. "We saw dirt and we called it death. But this child..." He gestured backward to Alara, who was shrinking into the coat. She saw the life underneath. She saw the value that God put there, not the value the market put there. Barney, feeling the tension in the air, let out a loud, demanding "Bah!" A ripple of laughter went through the men, nervous, relieved laughter. The tension broke. The wolf was gone. The master was back. And the garbage was demanding supper. "But master," Silas scratched his head, struggling to reconcile his worldview. "It's a house sheep now. It smells of... well, it smells of the cave." "Then we shall wash him," Caleb said simply. "And we shall feed him. Open the main house." "The main house?" Silas's eyes widened. "Not the barn?" "The barn was too cold for him once," Caleb said, tightening his grip on the lamb. "Tonight he sleeps by the fire." He turned and strode toward the porch of the stone house. Alara stood frozen near the gate. She watched them go. She assumed this was where they parted ways. The master went to his house, the servant went to the loft. She had been saved from the wolf, yes, and for that, she was eternally grateful. She would go back to her broom now, happy just to know Barney was safe. She turned toward the servants' quarters. "Alara," Caleb had stopped on the steps. He didn't turn around, but his voice was clear. "You have my coat," he said, "and you have my sheep. Do you intend to leave me with neither?" Alara spun around. Caleb looked back at her. The stern lines of his face had softened, smoothed out by the washing of the rain and the grace of the night. "The shepherd stays with the flock," he said. "Come inside." Alara took a step, then another. Her bare feet slapped against the wet stones, but she didn't feel the cold anymore. She felt a warmth that started in her toes and rose up to flush her cheeks. She walked past Silas, who was still staring at the spot where the master had stood. She walked up the stone steps. She crossed the threshold. The heavy door closed behind them, shutting out the wind, the rain, and the memory of the lonely broom. Inside, the house was a different world. The world inside the heavy oak door was not just a different room, it was a different climate. Elara had lived on this farm for 5 years. She knew the scullery, with its smell of lye soap and grease. She knew the barn, with its ammonia and straw. She knew the servants' loft, with its dust and draughts. But she had never, not once, stepped foot into the inner chamber. It was vast. The ceiling was lost in shadows, supported by beams of cedar that were dark with age and smoke. The floor was not packed earth or cold cobblestone, it was paved with smooth flagstones, covered in places by thick, woven rugs dyed in deep reds and indigos, but the centre of the universe was the hearth. It was a cavern of stone, large enough to roast an ox, dominating the far wall. A fire was already burning there, not the meagre, smoky twig fires of the courtyard, but a roaring blaze of seasoned olive wood logs. The heat hit Elara like a physical wave, thawing the ice that had encrusted her eyelashes. Caleb walked straight to the fire. His boots left muddy prints on the flagstones, but he did not look down. "Martha," he called out, his voice booming off the stone walls. A door to the kitchen flew open. Martha rushed in, wiping her hands on her apron, her face pale with worry. "Master, we heard the dogs, we thought—" She stopped. Her eyes went from the master to the muddy bundle in his arms, to the small shivering figure dripping water onto the rug by the door. "Mercy," Martha breathed, her hand going to her throat. Is that the girl?" "Get towels," Caleb ordered, his voice brooking no delay, "and warm water, and the healing salve. For the sheep, master," Martha asked, bewildered. "For the shepherd," Caleb said. He knelt by the hearth. With a groan of relief, he lowered Barney onto the thick rug that lay before the fire. Barney stood there for a second, bewildered by the lack of wind. He blinked his amber eyes at the flames. The heat was unlike anything he had ever known. It didn't just warm his skin, it seemed to penetrate his very marrow. Then, instinct took over. He shook himself. It was a violent, full-body shudder that started at his ears and rippled down to his tail. Mud, water, and bits of mountain grit flew in every direction. They splattered the pristine flagstones. They sprayed the expensive rug. They speckled the master's boots. Martha gasped in horror. "The rug! Master! That rug is from Damascus!" Caleb didn't look at the rug. He looked at the lamb, who was now sniffing the iron fire dogs with great interest. "It is just wool and dye, Martha," Caleb said quietly. "It can be washed. Life is harder to replace." He turned his gaze to the door. Elara was still standing there. She hadn't moved. She was still wrapped in the master's indigo cloak, which dragged on the floor around her like a puddle of ink. She looked at the fire, and she looked at her own feet, bare, bleeding and caked with mud. She looked down at the beautiful floor. She took a half-step backward, toward the door. I shouldn't be here," she whispered, her voice trembling for it. "I'm dirty." She was used to being the one who cleaned the mud, not the one who brought it in. The idea of tracking the mountain into this sanctuary felt like a sin. Caleb stood up. He left the warmth of the fire and walked back across the room. He stopped in front of her. He towered over her, casting a long shadow, but the shadow was warm. "Elara," he said. She looked up, flinching slightly, expecting to be sent to the scullery. "Look at the floor," Caleb commanded softly. Elara looked down. She saw her own muddy footprints. But then she saw the master's boots. They were caked with the same grey clay. His footprints led from the door, across the rug, straight to the fire. They were side by side with hers. "We walk the same path," Caleb said. "We carry the same mud. Do not be ashamed of the earth. Child, it is what we are made of." He reached out and gently unclasped the heavy cloak from her shoulders. It fell away, wet and heavy. Underneath, her tunic was ruined, torn by thorns and stained dark. She shivered violently, the cold air hitting her damp skin. "Come to the fire," Caleb said, "not as a servant, but as a guest." He placed a hand on her shoulder, lightly, respectfully, and guided her forward. Ilara walked. She stepped on the rug. It felt impossibly soft under her battered feet, like walking on moss. She approached the hearth. The heat wrapped around her. It was heavy and sweet, smelling of wood smoke and safety. She sat down on the edge of the stone hearth, her legs shaking so hard they would no longer hold her. Barney, seeing her, trotted over. He nudged her knee with his wet nose, then curled up right there on the Damascus rug, resting his chin on her foot. Martha returned, carrying a stack of thick, white linen towels and a basin of steaming water. She looked at the master, then at the girl, then at the lamb. The stern lines of her face crumpled. She didn't scold. She didn't complain about the mess. She knelt down beside Ilara. "Oh, you poor foolish little bird," Martha whispered, her voice thick with emotion. She took a warm towel and wrapped it around Ilara's hair, rubbing gently to dry the rain. Ilara closed her eyes. The terror of the mountain, the howl of the wolf, the scream of the wind, it all began to recede, pushed back by the crackling of the logs and the murmur of kind voices. She was inside. The door was bolted. The wolf was outside. And for the first time in her memory, the fire was not something she fed for others. It was burning for her. The basin of water was not silver, nor was it gold. It was common earthenware, glazed a humble brown, steaming gently in the firelight. Martha had finished drying Ilara's hair, leaving it a tangled halo of damp curls around her face. Now, she moved to attend to the girl's hands, but a large shadow fell across the rug. "Leave it, Martha," Caleb said softly. "Go fetch the broth and warm some milk for our other guest." Martha hesitated, looking at the master's hands that signed contracts and wielded the rod of authority. "But master," she murmured, "it is not fitting." "Go," Caleb repeated. His voice was not harsh, it was merely final. Martha bustled away toward the kitchen, the heavy oak door swinging shut behind her. Caleb pulled a low wooden stool close to the hearth. He sat down opposite Ilara. The fire popped, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney, casting a warm orange glow on his weathered face. He looked different in this light. The sharp angles of the accountant were gone. The deep lines around his eyes spoke only of fatigue and a strange, new peace. He reached out and took the basin of warm water. He placed it on the rug between them. "Give me your feet," he said. Lara froze. She tucked her feet further under the hem of the ruined tunic. They were shameful things, bruised blue by the cold, caked with the grey clay of the ridge, bleeding from a dozen small cuts where the shale had sliced her skin. "No, master," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the crackle of the logs. "They are dirty." "I know," Caleb said. "I saw where they walked." He didn't wait for her permission. He reached out and took her left ankle. His grip was firm but impossibly gentle. He lifted her foot and lowered it into the water. The sensation was overwhelming. The heat of the water surrounded her frozen skin, stinging sharply at first, then dissolving into a dull, throbbing ache of relief. Ilara gasped, tears pricking her eyes again. Caleb took a piece of soft linen cloth. He dipped it into the water, wringing it out until it was hot and damp. He began to wash. He scrubbed away the mud of the sheepfold. He washed away the dust of the sweeping. He cleaned the dirt from between her toes and the grime from her heels. He worked with the slow, deliberate concentration of the craftsman restoring a priceless artifact. Ilara watched him, her breath caught in her throat. This was the master, the man everyone feared, the man who sat on the high seat in the synagogue, and he was kneeling on his own floor, washing the feet of an orphan girl. "Why?" she choked out. Caleb didn't look up. He dipped the cloth again. "Because you walked into the dark when I stayed in the light," he said quietly. "Because you carried the burden I threw away." He lifted her foot from the water and dried it with a thick, white towel. Then he reached for a small jar of ointment that Martha had left on the table. It smelled of hyssop and olive oil, a sharp, clean scent. He dabbed the salve onto the cuts on her soles. The sting was sharp, but it was a good sting, the feeling of healing beginning. "This cut," Caleb murmured, tracing a jagged line on her instep. "The shale?" Ilara nodded. "And this bruise?" He touched her shin. "The wall?" Ilara nodded again. "Battle scars," Caleb pronounced solemnly. "You bear the marks of the shepherd." He finished with her feet and moved to her hands. He washed the knuckles that were raw from gripping the rock. He cleaned the palms that had held the rough wool. When he was done, Ilara felt new. She wasn't just clean, she felt lighter, as if the dirt had been the only thing holding her down to her old life. The kitchen door opened, and Martha returned. She carried a tray with a wooden bowl of steaming broth and a saucer of warm milk. "Here," Martha said, her voice unusually soft. She set the milk down on the rug near Barney's nose. The lamb, smelling the familiar treat, woke from his doze. He didn't stand up, he was too tired, but he stretched his neck out and began to lap at the saucer, his tail giving a few lazy thumps against the floor. Caleb took the bowl of broth. He held it out to Ilara. "Eat," he said. Ilara took the bowl. It was hot in her clean hands. It smelled of chicken and rosemary. She lifted the spoon. The first mouthful was warm and salty. It slid down her throat, warming her from the inside out. It was the taste of home. Not the home she swept, but a home she belonged to. She ate slowly, savouring every drop. Caleb and Martha watched her, silent sentinels in the firelight. "He will need a name," Caleb said suddenly, looking at the lamb who was now licking the empty saucer clean. "We cannot keep calling him the runt." Ilara lowered her spoon. She looked at Barney, whose fleece was beginning to dry into fluffy, albeit still slightly stained, curls. "He has a name," she said softly. Caleb raised an eyebrow. "Oh?" "Barney," Ilara said. "I called him Barney." Caleb smiled. It was a real smile this time, one that reached his eyes and crinkled the corners. "Barney," he repeated. "Barnabas, the son of encouragement. It is a good name, a strong name." He looked at the fire, watching the flames dance. "He encouraged me tonight. Ilara," Caleb said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "He and you encouraged an old man to remember who he was." He stood up and walked to the window. He unlatched the heavy shutter just a crack, peering out into the night. "The storm is over," he announced. "The stars are out." He turned back to the room. The firelight caught the silver in his beard and the white of the linen towel still in his hand. "Sleep now," he said. "The rug is soft. The fire will last until dawn. Martha will bring you a blanket." "But the loft?" Ilara asked, confused. "The loft is for servants," Caleb said firmly. "You are no longer a servant in this house. You are the one who guards the flock." He walked to the door leading to his own chambers. He paused, his hand on the latch. "Good night, Shepherd Ilara." The door clicked shut. Ilara sat in the silence of the great room. She looked at her clean hands. She looked at Barney, who had curled back up into a ball of white wool and was snoring softly. She looked at the fire that beat back the cold. She lay down on the Damascus rug. It was thicker and softer than any bed she'd ever known. She pulled the heavy indigo cloak over herself and the lamb. She wasn't hungry. She wasn't cold. She wasn't alone. The broom was forgotten. The fear was gone. As she drifted towards sleep, she listened to the sound of the house settling, the creak of the timbers, the pop of the embers. They were the sounds of a fortress that had opened its gates, and she was inside. The sun that rose over Greenhollow the next morning was not the pale, watery disk of winter. It was a coin of hammered gold, bold and bright, announcing that the storm had scrubbed the sky clean. Inside the main house, the light filtered through the thick glass of the high windows, falling in pools on the Damascus rug. Ilara woke slowly. She didn't wake to the crow of the rooster or the harsh clang of the work bell. She woke to the sound of a rhythmic, rasping lick. She opened one eye. A pink tongue, rough as a cat's but broad and warm, was methodically grooming her ear. "Barney," she mumbled, giggling sleepily and pushing the woolly face away. He bleated softly, bumping his nose against her cheek. He was hungry, and for the first time in his life, he was shouting about it indoors. Ilara sat up. The heavy indigo cloak slipped from her shoulders. She looked around the great room. The fire had burned down to a bed of glowing red coals, pulsing with a gentle heat. The terror of the night before felt like a dream, distant and fading. But the soreness in her legs was real. The bandages on her feet were real. And the master sitting at the long oak table was very real. Caleb was already dressed. He wore a clean tunic of grey linen and his working boots were polished. He was reading the ledger, a mug of steaming mint tea at his elbow. But he wasn't frowning at the numbers today. He looked up as Ilara stirred. "Good morning," he said. His voice was calm, holding the steady resonance of the morning bell. "Martha has laid out clothes for you on the chest. They belonged to my daughter when she was your age. They will fit." Ilara looked at the cedar chest. Folded neatly was a tunic of soft blue wool and a fresh linen undershift. No more grey rags. No more oversized coats. "Thank you, master," she whispered. "Dress," Caleb said, taking a sip of tea. "Then bring the beast outside. He smells of the mountain, and Silas is complaining that the courtyard smells like a petting zoo." There was a twinkle in his eye that belied the gruff words. Ilara dressed quickly behind the privacy screen. The clothes were soft against her skin, lacking the scratchiness of the burlap she was used to. She felt strange, taller, somehow. She led Barney to the door. He trotted beside her, his hooves clicking sharply on the flagstones. He didn't cower anymore. He walked with the entitlement of a creature who had slept on a master's rug. They stepped out into the courtyard. The farm was bustling. The shepherds were mending the pens damaged by the wind. The air smelled of wet earth and drying hay. When Ilara and the lamb appeared, the activity faltered. Heads turned. Hammers paused in mid-swing. Jonah, who was carrying a sack of grain, stopped and stared. They looked at the girl in the blue dress. They looked at the master walking behind her. And they looked at the lamb. Barney was a sight. His face was clean, his neck was white, but his body was still encased in the armour of old mud. He looked like a statue that was half finished. "Silas," Caleb called out. The head shepherd approached, wiping his hands on a rag. He looked at Ilara with a mixture of curiosity and newfound respect. He had seen the paw prints on the ridge this morning. He knew what she'd faced. "Yes, master?" "Prepare the wash trough," Caleb ordered. "Not the cold one. Fetch warm water from the kitchen, and bring the soap, the olive oil block we use for the prize rams." Silas's eyebrows shot up into his hairline. For the runt, master?" "For Barnabas," Caleb corrected. 10 minutes later, the courtyard of Greenhollow witnessed a ceremony usually reserved for royalty. The large copper tub was filled with steaming water. Martha brought the soap, a block of pure green olive oil soap that smelled of rain and freshness. Caleb rolled up his sleeves. "Ilara," he said, "he is your flock. You hold him." Ilara stepped forward. She put her arms around Barney's neck, whispering soothing words into his ear. He was nervous about the steam, but he trusted the voice. Caleb began to wash. This was not the frantic scrubbing in the cold mountain stream. This was a restoration. Caleb worked the rich lather into the matted fleece. The soap turned grey, then black, as it dissolved weeks of filth. The shepherds gathered around, watching in silence. Layer by layer, the history of the barn floor fell away. The mud of rejection dissolved. The stains of the cave vanished. And as the water was changed, Once, twice, 3 times, the miracle was revealed. The wool that emerged was not just white, it was blinding. It was thick, dense, and curled in perfect tight ringlets. It caught the morning sun and seemed to hold it, glowing with an inner luminescence. "Look at that," Jonah whispered, stepping closer. "I've never seen fleece like that. It's perfect." "It is the stress," Silas murmured, his eyes wide. "Sometimes, when a lamb survives a hard winter, the wool grows back stronger, denser, to keep the heat in." Caleb rinsed the final suds away. He stood back, wiping his wet hands on a towel. Barney stood in the tub, dripping wet, looking like a cloud that had fallen to earth. He shook himself, sending a spray of diamond droplets over the gathered men. They laughed, a warm, easy sound. "He's a survivor," Caleb announced to his men, "and he is part of this flock. Let no man raise a hand to him, and let no dog chase him." He turned to Alara. She was wet again. Her new blue dress splashed with water, but she was beaming. Her smile was no longer secret. It was wide and open, reflecting the sun. "Take him to the drying field," Caleb said gently. "Let the sun finish the work." Alara led Barney toward the grassy patch near the orchard. The lamb pranced, feeling light, feeling clean, feeling the air touch his skin for the first time in weeks. As they walked away, Caleb watched them. "You were right, Master," Silas said quietly, standing beside him. "The wool is silver. He will fetch a high price at the market." Caleb turned and looked at his head shepherd. His expression was mild, but his eyes were hard as flint. "Market?" Caleb asked. "This sheep is not for sale, Silas. Not for all the gold in Rome." He picked up his ledger from the bench where he had left it. He opened it to the page where, 3 weeks ago, he had made a scratch mark deleting a life. He dipped his quill in the ink. With a slow, deliberate hand, he crossed out the deletion. Beside it, in bold, flowing letters, he wrote, "Barnabas, the shepherd's own." He closed the book. The morning was bright. The air was sweet. And for the first time in 40 years, the master of Greenhollow felt that his accounts were truly balanced. The day folded its wings and settled into the quiet rhythm of the night. Outside, the wind had returned to the valley, but it was no longer the screaming fury of the storm. It was a gentle, humming breeze that brushed against the stone walls of the farmhouse like a cat rubbing against a leg. It whispered through the olive grove, rustling the leaves, telling stories of the high ridges to the listening earth. Inside the inner chamber, the world had slowed to the pace of a dying fire. Alara sat on the Damascus rug, her legs tucked under her new blue dress. She held a mug of warm milk, her second of the day, cupping it with both hands to feel the ceramic heat. She looked around the room. The shadows were long and soft, stretching from the corners like protective arms. The ledgers were closed. The work boots were set by the door. The heavy oak staff rested against the mantel. Everything was in its place. And for the first time in her life, Alara felt that she was in her place too. Barney lay beside her. He was no longer the muddy, shivering creature of the cave. He was a sprawling expanse of snowy white wool, taking up far more room than a lamb of his size should. He was deep in the sleep of the innocent, his legs twitching occasionally as he chased dream butterflies in a dream meadow that never ended. Master Caleb sat in his high-backed chair, the leather creaking softly as he shifted. He wasn't reading tonight. He was watching the fire, his eyes reflecting the slow dance of the embers. "Alara," he said softly. She looked up. She didn't flinch. "Do you know why the shepherd carries the staff?" he asked. Alara thought for a moment. "To fight the wolf?" "That is the rod," Caleb corrected gently. "The iron rod is for the enemy, but the staff has a crook." He reached out and traced the curve of the air with his finger. "The crook is to pull the sheep back when they wander too close to the edge," he said. "It is not for striking. It is for drawing near." He looked at her, his gaze steady and warm. "I have spent many years using the rod," Caleb confessed, his voice low. I fought the wolves of poverty. I fought the wolves of debt. I fought the wolves of grief. But I forgot the staff. I forgot how to draw people near. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. You taught me the staff again, Elara. You brought the lost thing home, not with a weapon, but with your arms. Elara lowered her mug. She looked at the sleeping lamb. She thought of the nights in the cave, the cold wind, the hunger she had endured to keep him alive. He wasn't lost. Master, she whispered. He was just hidden under the mud. Aren't we all? Caleb murmured. Aren't we all? The log in the fireplace broke apart with a soft shh pop, revealing a glowing heart of red gold. The heat pulsed outward, a silent wave of comfort. Elara yawned. It was a massive, jaw-cracking yawn that she couldn't suppress. The exhaustion of the last 3 weeks, the vigilance, the double life, the terror, was finally demanding its due. The day is done, Caleb said. He stood up and walked to the lampstand. One by one, he blew out the oil lamps. Puff. The kitchen corner went dark. Puff. The table faded into shadow. Puff. The hallway disappeared. Only the firelight remained, casting a golden dome of light over the rug. Sleep here tonight, Caleb said. The fire will keep. He didn't send her away. He picked up the indigo cloak, the mantle of the master, and draped it over her again. It felt lighter tonight. It felt like a promise kept. Good night, little shepherd, he whispered. Good night, master, Elara mumbled, her eyes already heavy. Caleb retreated to his room. The door clicked shut. Elara lay down. She nestled into the deep pile of the rug, pulling the cloak up to her chin. She reached out one hand and buried her fingers in Barney's clean, soft wool. He let out a long, shuddering sigh in his sleep, a sound of absolute contentment. She listened to the house. She heard the settling of the stones. She heard the wind singing a lullaby in the chimney. She heard the rhythmic breathing of the lamb. She closed her eyes. In her mind, she saw the high meadow, but there were no storms there. There were no wolves. There was only green grass, silver water, and the sun that never set. She saw herself running, not from fear, but for joy. She saw Barney leaping, his white fleece flashing like a signal fire of hope. She realised then that the mud had never been who he was. It was just something that had happened to him. And her loneliness? That was just mud too. It had washed away. The fire popped one last time, a gentle goodnight kiss from the hearth. Elara's breathing slowed, her hand relaxed. The dream took her. It was a dream of belonging, a dream of being held, a dream of a shepherd who never sleeps, watching over the girl and the lamb in the quiet, holy dark, and in the silence of Greenhollow, under the vast canopy of the Galilean stars, there was peace. And so, we leave them there, safe in the warmth of the inner chamber. We leave Elara and her lamb no longer defined by the dirt of their journey, but by the love that brought them home. As you drift into your own sleep tonight, remember this story. Remember that no matter how far you have wandered, or how heavy the mud of the world feels upon your shoulders, beneath it all, there is something precious, something white, something worthy of being carried. You are not the mistakes you have made. You are not the things that have happened to you. You are the treasure in the field. So, let the great shepherd watch over you now. Let the staff of comfort draw you near. The door is bolted. The wolf is gone. The fire is warm. Rest now. Good night.